Hey there, history lovers. Wherever you're watching from, Tokyo, London, a tiny town nobody can spell, you share something with every human alive. Your great-great-grandmother, 10,000 times over, lived in Africa. Same woman. The whole planet is basically one giant, slightly awkward family reunion, and the cradle was right here in East Africa, around 200,000 years ago. This is where humans became humans, and from this spot began a journey that ended in pyramids, in writing, in iron, in art so beautiful it still stops people cold. Tonight we set the record straight. 200,000 years of real history. The oldest cities on Earth, queens who went toe-to-toe with Rome and won, and the so-called black pharaohs who once ruled Egypt itself. Spoiler, none of this needed aliens. So hit that like button, and before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me where on this planet you're tuning in from. I want to see how far this family reunion really stretches. Lights down, settle in, we're starting at the very beginning. Let's roll. Picture a wound in the planet. Not a metaphor, an actual scar in the crust of the Earth, running roughly 4,800 kilometers from the highlands of Ethiopia, all the way down to the lakes of Malawi. Geologists call it the East African Rift, which is a respectably dry name for what is essentially the continent slowly tearing itself in half. Deep underground, currents in the molten rock have been dragging the land apart for millions of years, stretching the crust until it cracks, drops, and sinks. The result above ground is a landscape of plunging valleys, sudden cliffs, soda lakes that shimmer pink with flamingos, volcanoes that occasionally remind everyone who's in charge, and grasslands that roll onto the horizon. It is genuinely beautiful. It is also, geologically speaking, a slow-motion catastrophe, which turns out to be exactly the kind of place where the most interesting thing in the history of life decided to happen. The paleoanthropologist Richard Leakey, who spent a sizable chunk of his life crawling around this region looking for very old bones, liked to describe the rift as something close to a chemical test tube for evolution. And the comparison fits better than you might expect. A test tube is a place of controlled chaos, where conditions shift and ingredients react, and every so often, something brand new crystallizes out of the mess. The rift did the same thing to living creatures, only the timescale was a few million years rather than an afternoon at a lab bench. The climate here never sat still for long. Forests advanced and retreated. Lakes appeared, swelled, and vanished. Generously wet centuries gave way to brutally dry ones and then swung back again. For most animals, that kind of instability is simply terrible news. For one particular line of upright apes, it became the single most important pressure cooker in the history of the species. Here is the unglamorous mechanism humming away underneath all of it. When the environment keeps reshuffling the deck, the creatures that survive are the ones that can roll with the changes. The specialists, beautifully tuned to one climate or one food source, get quietly edited out the moment that climate disappears. The generalists, the improvisers, the ones who can switch diets, walk further on less, cooperate when things get tight, and outthink a bad season, those are the ones who hang around long enough to have grandchildren. Nature, in other words, was running an extremely long and extremely unsentimental audition, and the Rift Valley kept rewriting the script between takes. Over an enormous span of time, this relentless editing sculpted a brain that crept steadily larger, a body that walked tall and travelled light, hands freed from the ground and available for other work, and a creature flexible enough to thrive in a world that flatly refused to stay predictable. We did not appear in spite of the instability. We appeared because of it. It is worth lingering on how much that bigger brain actually cost, because evolution does not hand out upgrades for free. Brain tissue is monstrously hungry, burning through a wildly disproportionate share of the body's energy, just sitting there doing nothing in particular. Carrying one around is a bit like installing a high-performance engine in a car that now needs premium fuel at every stop, which is a hard luxury to justify unless it genuinely earns its keep. In a stable paradise, it might not. In the shifting, unforgiving rift, where the ability to plan, remember, and improvise was the difference between eating and not eating, that expensive engine paid for itself again and again. The environment was effectively willing to subsidize intelligence, and so intelligence is what it got. There is a common assumption about how this all unfolded that is worth correcting straight away, because almost everyone gets the order wrong. People tend to imagine the brain came first, that our ancestors got clever, and then, being clever, decided to stand up and walk around on two legs to free their brilliant hands. The actual sequence was the reverse, and by a staggering margin. Walking upright came first, millions of years before the brain did anything especially impressive. For an enormous stretch of time, there were upright, two-legged creatures wandering the African grasslands with hands fully freed for carrying and gathering and tinkering, while the brain perched on top remained, to put it politely, modest. The hands were ready and waiting long before the mind arrived to make proper use of them. Only much later, with the basic equipment already in place, did the brain begin its slow and expensive expansion. Evolution, it turns out, tends to build the workshop years before it hires anyone clever enough to work in it. So already we can throw out the first lazy assumption, the one where Africa shows up in old textbooks as a sort of timeless, unchanging backdrop where nothing much ever developed. That picture has it precisely backwards. This was not a sleepy corner of the world waiting around for history to arrive from somewhere more important. This was the workshop. This was the room where the prototype got built, tested, scrapped, redesigned, and tested again until it finally worked. And the single strongest piece of evidence for that sat undiscovered in the Ethiopian dirt until embarrassingly recently. It is worth saying a word about the conditions the searchers were working in, because the part of Ethiopia that gave up these treasures is not a gentle place. This stretch of the rift includes some of the hottest, lowest, most punishing terrain anywhere on the planet. A sun-hammered expanse of salt flats, volcanic rock, and shimmering heat where daytime temperatures climb to levels that send most sensible life into hiding. There is little shade, less water, and no comfort to speak of. Spending weeks crawling slowly across that ground, eyes fixed on the dirt, searching for the faint difference between an ordinary pebble and a fragment of a 100,000-year-old skull, is not the romantic adventure that documentaries tend to imply. It is hot, slow, eye-straining, back-breaking labour, performed in a landscape that seems actively opposed to your presence. That the most important human fossils on Earth keep emerging from one of the least hospitable corners of it is one of those small jokes the planet seems to enjoy playing. The year was 1997, in the northern stretch of the Ethiopian Rift, in a sun-blasted region where the ground is layered like a stack of pancakes that have been left under a heavy weight for 160,000 years. Seasonal rains had done the slow, patient work no shovel can rush, washing away the upper sediment and exposing far older layers underneath. This is the quiet rhythm of fossil hunting that nobody bothers to put in the movies. You do not usually dig your way to a great discovery so much as you arrive at the right moment, after the right storm, and notice the thing the weather has politely uncovered on your behalf. Show up a decade too early and there is nothing to see. Show up a decade too late and it has already eroded into gravel and blown away across the plain. Timing, unsurprisingly, is half the job, and patience is most of the other half. It is hard to overstate how rare a find like this really is, because the deck is stacked savagely against any bone surviving at all. The overwhelming majority of creatures that have ever lived left absolutely no trace. When something dies, the usual fate is to be eaten, scattered, gnawed, weathered, and dissolved back into the soil within a few short years, leaving nothing for anyone to find 100 millennia later. To become a fossil at all, a body has to get extraordinarily lucky in a grim sort of way. Buried quickly by sediment or ash before the scavengers, and the weather can do their work, then left undisturbed through unimaginable spans of time, then lifted back to the surface at the precise moment a human being who knows what they are looking at happens to be walking past. Every link in that chain is improbable, and they all have to happen in sequence. This is why each near-complete ancient skull is treated less like a routine data point, and more like a winning ticket in a cosmic lottery with terrible odds. The fossil record is not a tidy library. It is a scattering of accidents that we are absurdly fortunate to read at all. The team noticed bone where there really should not have been any, and as they carefully worked the surface, a skull began to emerge. Not a fragment, not a single stray tooth of the kind that launches 1,000 academic arguments, but a nearly complete cranium, which in this line of work is roughly the equivalent of winning a lottery you did not know you had entered. They named it Idaltu, a word from the local Afar language meaning something close to elder or firstborn. It was a fitting name, because what they were cradling was, in a very real sense, one of the senior members of the family. The skull turned out to be around 160,000 years old. That date is not a guess, and it is worth understanding how anyone can speak so confidently about a number that large, because it is one of the genuinely clever tricks of the whole field. The rift is volcanically restless, and volcanoes are extremely useful to scientists in one specific way. Every so often, an eruption blankets the landscape in ash, and that ash contains minerals whose internal clocks start ticking the instant they cool. By measuring the slow, steady breakdown of certain elements locked inside those minerals, researchers can pin down how long ago a given ash layer fell, often with startling precision. So when a fossil is found sandwiched neatly between two datable volcanic layers, you do not have to date the bone itself at all. You simply note that it is younger than the layer beneath it, and older than the layer above it, and the rock obligingly brackets the answer for you. The skull did not come with a birth certificate, but the geology around it filled one out anyway. What made Idaltu genuinely electrifying was not just the age but the shape. The researcher Bahenias Faye, who studied the find closely, kept pointing to the detail that mattered most. This was not some halfway creature, some rough intermediate sketch on the road to humanity. The face was modern. The brain case was modern. The rounded back of the skull, the part that quietly tells specialists an enormous amount about who they are actually looking at, was modern too. Put bluntly, it was us. Not a near relative, not a cousin we eventually lost touch with, but an anatomically modern human, alive and walking around the Horn of Africa more than 150,000 years ago, carrying a skull you could set on a shelf next to a person living today and struggle to tell apart. When specialists say anatomically modern, they mean a specific checklist. A high and rounded brain case rather than a long low one, a flat and tucked-in face rather than a jutting one, a forehead that rises instead of slopes, and the small bony bump on the chin that, oddly enough, no other human species ever bothered to grow. Idaltu ticked the boxes. It became one of the most powerful arguments ever found that our species was born on this continent. Full stop. There was a further detail about these remains that hinted at something stirring beyond mere survival. The skulls from this site carried subtle marks, fine cuts, and a smooth polish across certain surfaces, the kind of wear that does not come from being trampled in the dirt or chewed by a passing predator. To the specialists, the pattern suggested the bones had been deliberately handled, cleaned, and perhaps carried or displayed by the living, repeatedly, over time. That is a quietly enormous thing to read into a piece of weathered bone. It points towards some of the earliest faint evidence of people treating their dead as something more than a problem to be left behind, of a mind that lingered over loss and marked it with care rather than indifference. We will not push that too far here, because a few marks on a skull can only tell us so much. But it is a small reminder that the creature behind that modern face was beginning to carry around something other animals do not seem to bother with, a sense that the people who came before mattered and were worth remembering. It helps to know that finds like this did not arrive out of nowhere, and that the family doing the noticing had been at it for generations. Richard Leakey was not the first in his household to make the African ground give up its secrets. His parents had spent decades patiently excavating ancient sites elsewhere on the continent, building the unfashionable case, piece by stubborn piece, that the deep human story belonged to Africa at a time when most of the academic world assumed the important action had taken place somewhere more flattering to European sensibilities. They were, for a long stretch, swimming firmly against the current. The bones kept proving them right, which is the most satisfying way to win an argument, and by the time Idaltu surfaced, the unfashionable case had quietly become the consensus. It is worth pausing on what was happening elsewhere on the planet at this exact moment, because the contrast is the part that really lands. While anatomically modern humans were already established in East Africa, Europe was the territory of an entirely different people, the Neanderthals. They were not the slouching, grunting brutes of the old cartoons, to be fair to them. They were tough, intelligent, fire-using, tool-making survivors who handled Ice Age Europe with a competence most of us would not last a long weekend without. They cared for their injured, buried at least some of their dead, and ran down dangerous game in conditions that would send a modern person straight back indoors. But they were a separate branch entirely, a different kind of human, built broad and powerful and barrel-chested for a frozen world. And the simple, slightly humbling fact is that the modern face, the one staring back out of every mirror on Earth today, did not first appear in the caves of Europe or anywhere across Asia. It appeared in Africa first, and it had a very long head start. The Neanderthals also puncture another comfortable misconception, the one where human evolution is pictured as a tidy single-file parade. That famous line of figures marching from a stooped ape on the left to an upright modern person striding off the right edge of the poster. It is a wonderfully clear image, and it is almost entirely wrong. The real shape of our family is not a ladder with one rung leading neatly to the next. It is a sprawling, branching, distinctly messy bush, with many different kinds of human budding off, overlapping, coexisting, and dying out at various times. For long stretches of the past, there was not one human species on Earth but several, sharing the planet, sometimes living in the same eras and even, as we now know, occasionally meeting and mingling. The Neanderthals of Europe were only one such branch. There were others scattered across Asia and beyond, some known only from a stray finger bone or a single tooth. The startling truth is that being the only human species around, which feels so obvious and permanent to us, is actually a strange and recent novelty. For most of the story, we had company, and the lonely throne we sit on today is the exception, not the rule. This is the moment the old map of human origins quietly got redrawn. For a long time, the story of where we came from was told as if the answers would obviously turn up in Europe, in no small part because that is simply where most of the early scientists happened to live, work, and dig. Africa, in those tellings, was an afterthought, the place you mentioned in a footnote and then moved swiftly past. The bones themselves had other ideas. The deeper anyone dug here, the older and more important the finds became, until the footnote quietly swallowed the entire book. The cradle was not located in the places that had confidently assumed they owned the story. It was here, in the test tube, in the valley that kept tearing itself apart and accidentally assembling a human in the process. And once you accept that the body came from here, a second and even stranger question opens up directly underneath it. Skulls and bones can show you the shape of an ancestor, but they cannot sketch you the family tree. They cannot tell you how the scattered billions of people alive right now are actually connected to one another, if at all. For that you have to stop reading the rocks and start reading something far smaller and far more talkative, something every single one of us is carrying around inside our cells at this very moment, whether we ask for it or not. The answer came from genetics, and it is one of the most quietly mind-bending results modern science has ever produced. When researchers traced the deep maternal ancestry of living humans, following the line back through mothers and their mothers before them, all of it converged. Not onto a region, not onto a vague population. It converged onto a single direct maternal line leading back to one woman who lived in Africa somewhere between roughly 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. Scientists handed her the nickname Mitochondrial Eve, and the nickname has caused a steady stream of confusion ever since, so let us defuse it before it gets out of hand. She was not the only woman alive at the time. She was not a solitary Eve standing in an empty garden waiting for the species to begin. There were plenty of other people around her, living full lives, raising children, leaving descendants of their own. The thing that makes her special is narrow, specific, and genuinely fascinating once it clicks into place. To understand it, you first have to understand mitochondria, which sounds like the opening line of an exceptionally dull biology lecture, but is in fact the key to the entire detective story. Inside almost every cell in your body there are tiny structures called mitochondria, the little engines that convert food into usable energy. The classic textbook description is the powerhouse of the cell, a phrase that has lodged itself so firmly in education that it's sometimes the only fact a person retains from years of biology class. The detail that matters for us is that mitochondria carry their own small separate loop of DNA, kept entirely distinct from the vast genetic library packed away in the nucleus. And here is the quirk that makes everything possible. This mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost exclusively through the mother. When a child is conceived, the mother supplies the mitochondria. The father contributes a great deal to who you turn out to be, but his mitochondrial DNA simply does not make the trip to the next generation. It is, to put it kindly, not on the guest list. So follow the logic carefully because it is the whole game. Your mitochondrial DNA came from your mother, essentially unchanged. Hers came from her mother. That woman got it from her own mother, and on backward through deep time in an unbroken chain that only ever runs through women. Every link in that chain is a daughter, who had at least one surviving daughter of her own, who then had a surviving daughter, again and again and again, with no gaps permitted anywhere. Break the chain at any point, have only sons in a single generation, and that particular maternal line goes dark forever, no matter how many grandchildren and great-grandchildren follow happily through the male side. It is a brutally simple filter. Sons are perfectly good descendants in every other respect, beloved and consequential, and carrying half their mother's nuclear genes. But for this one specific molecule, they are a polite dead end every single time. When you run that filter back across thousands upon thousands of generations, an astonishing amount of pruning takes place. Countless maternal lines simply terminate somewhere along the road, extinguished by nothing more dramatic than the ordinary accident of a generation that happened to produce only boys. And when you trace every surviving line back far enough, they all eventually knit together into one. That convergence point is mitochondrial Eve. She earns the title not because she was unique or remarkable in her own time, but because she belongs to the single maternal lineage that managed to thread the needle every generation without fail, producing enough daughters in an unbroken female chain to carry her mitochondrial signature all the way down to the people watching this right now. Everyone alive today inherited that small loop of code from her. The other women of her era were just as real, just as loved, and just as important. But their direct maternal lines eventually hit a generation of sons somewhere down the centuries and quietly closed the door. There is a neat companion to all this that makes the picture even more entertaining. The exact same trick works in reverse with the Y chromosome, which passes only from father to son, untouched, generation after generation. Trace every man's Y chromosome back, and you reach a single male ancestor, inevitably nicknamed Y chromosomal Adam. The natural temptation is to imagine the two of them as a couple, the original man and the original woman strolling through paradise together. Resist it. They almost certainly never met, never knew the other existed, and may well have lived thousands of years apart in entirely different parts of the continent. They are not a romance. They are just two separate statistical bottlenecks in two separate inheritance systems, which is admittedly a far less catchy story for a stained glass window. How do scientists even arrive at a date for someone who left no monument, no grave, and no written record of any kind? They use what is often called a molecular clock, and the idea behind it is elegant. Mitochondrial DNA accumulates small, harmless copying errors over time at a reasonably steady, predictable rate, like a clock that ticks not in seconds but in tiny mutations. Compare the mitochondrial DNA of two living people, and you can count the differences between them. The more differences, the longer ago they shared a common maternal ancestor. Count the differences across people from every corner of the planet, calibrate the ticking rate, and you can estimate how far back the lines all converge. That is where the figure of roughly 150 to 200,000 years comes from. It is not a stab in the dark. It is arithmetic performed on the living tissue of the entire human species. This converging line did more than identify a distant ancestor. It quietly ended a long and occasionally bad-tempered argument. For years, scientists had been split between two broad ideas about where modern humans came from. One camp held that our species had emerged in many places at once, with the scattered older populations across different continents, all gradually evolving into modern humans more or less in parallel, a sort of worldwide group project. The other camp argued for a single recent origin, one place, one source population, spreading out from there to replace or absorb everyone else. The genetics came down hard on the second view. If humanity had truly bubbled up independently across the globe over a very long time, the deep maternal lines would scatter back to many different ancient roots in many different regions. Instead, they all funneled back to one recent point, and that point sat in Africa. The DNA of living people in effect cast a vote, and the result was not especially close. The single African origin won. The conclusion you arrive at from all of this is the part that genuinely rearranges how people think. If every living human descends from a recent African population, and if our species spent the overwhelming majority of its existence inside Africa long before anyone wandered out, then for the deepest stretch of human history there was simply one kind of human, and that human was dark-skinned, finely adapted to a sunny continent, living in the place where the entire story began. The pale skin, the wildly varied faces, the whole visual catalogue of human appearance that people have burned so much energy arguing over, every bit of that came later. It emerged gradually across tens of thousands of years as small groups pushed into new climates with weaker sunlight and different demands, which means the differences we so often treat as enormous and fundamental are, as scientists have put it, almost literally skin deep. The pigmentation is a thin surface adjustment, a recent and superficial coat of paint. Underneath it, the machinery is the same machinery, inherited from the same family, traceable to the same handful of ancestors in the same African landscape. It is worth understanding why skin colour shifted at all, because the real reason is far more interesting than the nonsense that got built on top of it. Skin pigment is essentially a sun shield, and the substance responsible, melanin, exists to protect the body from the more damaging end of sunlight. Under the powerful sun of equatorial Africa, dark skin was straightforwardly the better engineered option, guarding the body's chemistry against an intense ultraviolet bombardment. But there was a trade-off lurking, because the body also needs a modest dose of sunlight to manufacture vitamin D, and too much shielding in a place with weak, slanting sun leaves a person short. So as groups migrated into the dim, grey skies of the far north, where the sun is a rumour for half the year, lighter skin offered a real advantage, letting in just enough of that scarce sunlight to keep the chemistry running. Skin tone, in other words, is not a marker of rank or worth or ability. It is a sensible local adjustment to how much sun happens to fall on a given patch of the planet, no more profound than the fact that desert animals tend to be pale and forest animals tend to be dark. The body simply optimized for the weather. There is one more genetic fact that drives the whole point home with surprising force, and it tends to catch people off guard. For a species spread across every continent, in every conceivable shade and shape, humans are remarkably, almost suspiciously similar to one another at the genetic level. We carry far less internal variation than you would ever guess from looking at a crowded street. In fact, a single troop of chimpanzees living on one hillside can hold more genetic diversity among themselves than the entire human population of the planet does. Let that sink in for a moment. Every human who has ever caught your eye, in every country, of every appearance, is part of a group so genetically tight-knit that a handful of apes in one forest out-diversify all of us combined. The reason is exactly the story we have been telling. We are a young species that recently passed through narrow bottlenecks, sprang from a modest founding population, and simply has not had the time to accumulate much variety. We are, in the most measurable and literal way, an unusually close family that has been arguing for far too long about a coat of paint. Now, you would think a discovery this elegant, this unifying, and frankly this humbling, would have been welcomed warmly the moment it became clear. History naturally had other plans. Long before anyone could read a strand of DNA, back in the 18th century during the era that fondly called itself the Enlightenment, certain European thinkers were busy constructing elaborate rankings of humanity, sorting people into tidy categories, and, in a twist that will shock absolutely no one, placing themselves comfortably at the very top. The reasoning was not science in any sense we would now recognise. It was prejudice wearing the costume of scholarship, dressed up with charts, measurements, and confident Latin to make it sound respectable in a drawing room. Out of that effort came the grotesque and utterly baseless myth that African people were somehow lesser, less fully human, a separate and inferior kind of being. It was a lie with consequences that stretched across centuries and was used to excuse enormous cruelty. And it was, we now know beyond the faintest doubt, the exact and total opposite of the truth. The very people being slandered as less than human belong to the oldest, deepest, most foundational branch of the entire human family. Everyone else on the planet is, in the most literal genealogical sense possible, a more recent offshoot of them. There is a final irony in all of this that Richard Leakey was fond of pointing out, and it makes a fitting spot to leave the genetics behind. The entire scientific framework for understanding human evolution, the whole intellectual apparatus for asking where our species came from, was assembled during an age when the wider world knew almost nothing real about Africa at all. The scholars building the grand theories had barely glimpsed the continent that quietly held every important answer. They were attempting to map the origin of humanity while standing as far as they possibly could from the place where humanity actually originated, working largely from assumption, second-hand rumour, inherited bias, and the occasional fragment shipped back to be admired in a European museum case. It is a little like trying to write the definitive history of a house, while flatly refusing to set foot in the room where it was built. The answers were always there in the African ground, lying patiently under the sediment, waiting for the right rains and the right people to come along and finally read them, which leaves us with a clear picture and a much larger question hanging over it. The body came from here, the family came from here, the shape of the human face and the single thread of shared ancestry both trace cleanly back to this one extraordinary continent. But a body and a bloodline are only the raw material. A creature with a modern skull and a deep family tree is not yet a creature with cities, art, writing, kings, or the strange and restless ambition to leave a mark that outlasts its own short life. Something else had to happen. Some additional spark had to catch, the thing that turned a clever, adaptable animal into the kind of being that would eventually fan out across every habitable corner of the planet and start building. That spark, and the great journey it set in motion, is exactly where the story turns next. For an almost unimaginably long stretch of time, our species did not go anywhere. With the modern body finished and the shared family already in place, you might expect the next move to be a confident march out across the globe. It did not happen. For something on the order of 120,000 years, anatomically modern humans stayed put inside Africa, spreading slowly across the continent, settling its coasts and grasslands and river valleys, but never quite spilling over the edges in any lasting way. By every measure that matters in the body and the bones, these people were already us, and yet they lingered at home for an eternity, like a fully grown adult who has the car keys, a full tank of fuel, and absolutely no intention of leaving the neighbourhood. Then something shifted. Somewhere between roughly 80,000 and 50,000 years ago, a relatively small group acquired some kind of advantage, and the long stillness broke. What followed was one of the most explosive expansions in the entire history of life on Earth. In a span of time that, against the backdrop of everything we have covered so far, amounts to little more than an eye blink, the descendants of that group fanned out and occupied nearly the whole planet. They pushed into the Near East, across the breadth of Asia, up into the frozen north, down through the islands, and eventually onto continents no human foot had ever touched. The pace is genuinely staggering. A creature that had been content to stay in one continent for over 100 millennia suddenly reached the far corners of the world in a handful of thousands of years. Something had changed, and it was not the body. The skeleton was the same. Whatever flipped the switch was happening on the inside. It is worth picturing how that exit even worked, because the geography of it is more dramatic than the dry phrase out of Africa suggests. The continent is not easy to leave. To the north sat a forbidding desert barrier, and the most plausible doorway was instead at the far southeastern corner, where only a narrow strip of sea separates the Horn of Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. During the colder ages of the world, enormous quantities of water were locked up in ice sheets, which dropped sea levels considerably and shrank that gap into something a determined group might manage, hugging the shoreline, living off shellfish and whatever the coast provided. The leading idea is that the great expansion crept outward along the edges of the sea, rather than charging across open interiors. A slow, beachcombing advance that, generation by generation, carried people further and further from the land of their birth. Nobody set out to colonize the planet. They simply followed the coast to the next good spot, and then the next, and a few thousand years of that adds up to a world. There is a humbling genetic wrinkle to that departure as well. The group that actually made it out and went on to populate the rest of the world was, it turns out, remarkably small. A modest band rather than a great migrating host. This is why, even today, the entire population outside Africa carries only a slim slice of the full human genetic range, while the deepest and richest variety remains on the African continent, where the species spent the bulk of its history. Put bluntly, everyone living beyond Africa, all the staggering variety of peoples across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and the islands, descends from what was essentially one small group of travellers who slipped through that coastal doorway. The rest of the world is, genetically speaking, a single African family reunion that simply wandered very far from home and lost track of how closely everyone is still related. Just how flexible these travellers were becomes clear when you look at where they ended up, because some of those destinations could not be reached by simply walking. To arrive in the ancient landmass that became Australia and New Guinea, people had to cross open stretches of sea, water too wide to wade and too deep to see across, at a time tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. You do not stumble onto a distant shore you cannot see by accident. Reaching it meant building some kind of watercraft, gathering a group willing to push off from the safety of the known coast, and setting out across open water toward land that might not even exist, on the strength of a guess and a plan. That is not the behaviour of a creature merely following its nose to the next meal. It is deliberate, collective, forward-looking risk, the kind only a planning, talking, imagining mind would ever attempt. The same species also learned to survive scorching deserts, freezing tundra, dense rainforest and high mountains, adjusting not its body but its knowledge to each one. No other large animal has ever come close to living comfortably across such a spread of worlds, and the reason is the cultural toolkit we have been describing, packed up and carried everywhere it went. The obvious question is what that advantage actually was, and here even the people who have studied it longest tend to lower their voices and admit they are partly guessing. Richard Leakey, who knew this terrain as well as anyone, once confessed that he genuinely wished he understood exactly what had happened, but that his instinct kept pointing him toward one answer above all others. He suspected it was speech, not noise, not the grunts and calls that plenty of animals manage perfectly well, but real language, the full open-ended system of words and grammar that lets a mind take a thought and pour it, more or less intact, straight into another mind. If that hunch is right, then the great expansion was not powered by stronger muscles or sharper tools, it was powered by talking. It is easy to underrate language because we are swimming in it every waking second, but step back and the thing is close to miraculous. Most animals are locked inside their own skulls, each one figuring out the world largely from scratch, with only the crudest signals to share what they know. Language shatters that wall. With it, a single useful discovery, where the water is, which plants heal and which kill, how to bring down a dangerous animal without becoming lunch, no longer dies with the individual who found it. It can be spoken aloud, taught, corrected, improved, and handed to the next generation, who start not from zero, but from wherever the last generation left off. Knowledge stops evaporating and starts stacking. Each generation inherits the hard-won lessons of all the ones before and adds a little of its own on top. Scientists sometimes call this the ratchet effect, because like a ratchet it only clicks forward and rarely slips back, and it is arguably the single most powerful trick our species has ever pulled. No other creature accumulates wisdom across the centuries the way a talking one does. There is a slightly deflating truth buried in all this that is worth admitting out loud. The reason humans are so formidable is not that any one of us is a towering genius. Drop a single modern person, stripped of everything they own, into the wilderness, and they would struggle to produce so much as a decent stone blade, let alone rediscover metalworking or write a sentence. Almost nobody alive could build, entirely from scratch and unaided, even the simplest tools they use every day. Our power has never really been individual. It is collective, distributed across the whole web of people who came before and stand beside us, each contributing a tiny piece to a vast shared store of know-how that no single mind could ever hold on its own. We are not clever because each of us is brilliant. We are clever because we pull centuries of accumulated cleverness and let language do the carrying. The genius is in the network, and language is the wiring that makes the network possible. Language did something else too, something less obvious but just as important. It let people coordinate at a scale and a subtlety no silent animal could match. A pack of wolves can hunt together, certainly, but they cannot sit down the night before and agree on a plan, assign roles, describe the terrain, and adjust the strategy halfway through with a few quiet words. Humans could. Language turned a crowd of separate individuals into something more like a single distributed mind, able to share information across distance and time, to make promises, to build trust, to organize labor, and to hold a group together with nothing more solid than agreed-upon ideas. A band that could talk could plan, and a band that could plan could outmaneuver creatures far stronger and faster than itself. The species that conquered the planet did not do it with claws, it did it with conversation. And language unlocked one final door that may be the most important of all, because it let the mind deal in things that are not physically there. A wolf can think about the rabbit it can see. A talking human can think about the rabbit that might be over the next hill tomorrow, the rabbit their grandmother once described. The spirit of the rabbit, the meaning of the rabbit in a story told around the fire. Words let people handle the absent, the future, the imaginary and the abstract, and once a mind can do that, it can plan for seasons it has never lived through, fear dangers it has never met, and imagine a world different from the one in front of its eyes. That capacity for the abstract is the hinge on which everything else swings. It is the difference between an animal that merely survives its environment and a being that begins to reshape it. There is one more gift hidden inside language that deserves a mention because it built the very glue of human society. Once people could speak of things that were not physically present, they could also share things that were not physically real at all, agreed upon ideas that exist only because everyone decides to believe in them together. A story told around the fire, a rule about who may marry whom, a shared belief about where the world came from or what happens after death, an understanding that this group and that group are kin and owe one another loyalty. None of these things can be touched or seen, yet they hold communities together more firmly than any wall. Language let humans weave invisible webs of meaning and then live inside them, binding strangers into a single tribe through nothing but shared belief. Long before any temple was raised, people were almost certainly telling each other stories that explained the world and bound them to one another, and those stories did real work, turning a loose collection of individuals into a people. The capacity to believe the same invisible things together may be the quietest and most powerful trick of all. There is a frustrating catch to the whole language theory that is worth naming honestly, and it explains why even the experts hedge. Speech leaves no fossil. A bone can sit in the ground for 100,000 years and still be read. A spoken word vanishes the instant it is uttered, gone forever into the air, leaving not the faintest physical trace for anyone to dig up later. This means the single adaptation that may have mattered most, the one that arguably handed our ancestors the world, is precisely the one we can never observe directly. We cannot excavate a sentence. We cannot date a conversation. Everything we believe about when and how complex language emerged has to be inferred sideways, read off indirect clues like the symbolic objects people left behind, the planning their journeys required, and the subtle architecture of the throat and skull that hints at what sounds a mouth could make. It is a peculiar situation, building the case for the most powerful tool in human history, almost entirely from circumstantial evidence, like a detective certain of the culprit, but holding not one direct witness, which is exactly why a careful thinker like Richard Leakey could only call it a feeling. The hunch is strong, the logic is compelling, and the proof, by the cruel nature of sound itself, will always stay just out of reach. For a long time, the standard story held that all of this arrived in a sudden burst, a kind of switch flipping somewhere around 50,000 years ago, as if humanity woke up one morning and abruptly became clever and creative after 100,000 years of dull competence. Newer evidence has been quietly dismantling that tidy tale. The capacity for what specialists call behavioral modernity, the symbolic thinking, the planning, the sense of meaning that sets us apart, did not switch on overnight in some foreign land. It had been simmering in Africa for a very long time before anyone left, building gradually rather than exploding all at once. The light did not snap on. It came up slowly, like a sunrise on the African continent, long before the Great Walk Outward began. This matters enormously for how we picture the people who spread across the world, because it means they did not leave carrying only their genes, they left carrying culture. Out of Africa walked human beings who already possessed ideas about beauty, who decorated themselves and marked their belongings, who understood themselves as members of a group with shared customs, who had concepts of meaning and identity and belonging that no skeleton can ever preserve. The most precious cargo in that migration was invisible. It was not stored in the bones or the muscles, but in the mind and the shared imagination of the travellers. The body had been ready for ages. What finally went out into the world was a way of thinking, and that, more than anything physical, is the true inheritance Africa handed to every culture that would ever follow. One of the quiet proofs that these were people bound together by ideas rather than just proximity is that useful materials began to travel surprising distances. Archaeologists keep finding stone of a particular quality, or seashells, or lumps of pigment, turning up far inland or far down the coast from the only places they could have come from. Objects do not walk on their own. For a desirable material to end up dozens or even hundreds of kilometers from its source, people had to be carrying it, passing it hand to hand, trading it, gifting it, or moving along established routes that connected one group to the next. That implies relationships stretching well beyond the immediate band around the fire, networks of contact and exchange and reputation, linking scattered communities across the land. These were not isolated little clans staring suspiciously at the horizon every waking moment. They were nodes in a web, and the things that travelled along that web were early evidence of an economy, a society, and a shared sense of value, all running on the social glue that language made possible. It is worth trying to feel what that age might have been like from the inside, and researchers who have thought about it reach for a comparison that sounds almost playful but is unsettlingly apt. The closest modern image of that world, they suggest, is the landscape of a post-apocalyptic story, Picture it. Small scattered bands of people, never very many, moving across a vast and largely empty land. The darkness beyond the firelight is genuinely dangerous, prowled by powerful animals that view a human as a reasonable meal, so the night is something to be guarded against rather than enjoyed. Strangers are rare, and the appearance of an unfamiliar group is a moment heavy with uncertainty, because there is no telling whether they come as friends, rivals, or something worse. Resources are never guaranteed, the next meal is never promised, and the small circle of people you know and trust is quite literally the only thing standing between you and a hostile world. It was a life of tight bonds and wide silences, of profound dependence on the handful of others who shared your fire. Strip away the special effects and the survival dramas we watch for entertainment, and you are looking at something close to the actual emotional texture of the human dawn. That, then, was the situation when the symbolic mind we have been describing first started leaving solid traces in the ground, and the single most spectacular trace of it sits not in some celebrated European cavern, but on the wild southern coast of Africa, where two great oceans crash together and the land meets the sea in a tumble of cliffs and wind. The story of its discovery has a pleasing ordinariness to it. In 1991, an archaeologist named Christopher Henshelwood was exploring a stretch of coastal land that happened to belong to his own family, ground his grandfather had once held near that meeting point of the oceans. While poking around the rugged shoreline, he noticed an opening in the rock, the entrance to a cave. There is something quietly delightful about the fact that one of the most important windows into the origins of the human mind was found not by a grand expedition with maps and funding, but by a man wandering across his own grandfather's property and stopping to look at a hole in a cliff. The cave is now known as Blombos, and what it held would force a serious rewrite of when and where the human imagination first came alive. Inside, the layers of sediment recorded an astonishing depth of time, with signs of people living in and returning to the cave across well over 100,000 years. But the real prize, the find that sent a jolt through the field, was modest in size and immense in meaning. It was a small piece of ochre, a soft reddish mineral, and across one smoothed face of it, someone, tens of thousands of years ago, had deliberately scratched a careful pattern of crisscrossing lines, a neat geometric design of intersecting strokes. It was not an accident. It was not a scratch from a tool slipping or an animal gnawing. It was a chosen, intentional, abstract design, made by a person who picked up a sharp point and decided to create a pattern for no reason other than that it meant something to them. That little engraved stone is around 77,000 years old, and today it rests in the care of the Iziko Museum in Cape Town, where it sits as one of the oldest known pieces of deliberate symbolic art on the planet. You might reasonably wonder how anyone fixes a date on a scratched stone with that kind of confidence, given that, as we saw earlier, ordinary methods have their limits. Here the trick relies on a different and rather beautiful principle. Buried mineral grains, sand and the like, quietly soak up a tiny steady dose of natural radiation from their surroundings over the centuries, storing it up like a slowly filling battery. Expose those grains to light or heat, and they release that stored energy as a faint glow, and crucially the clock resets the moment they are exposed. By measuring how much energy a buried grain has accumulated since it was last exposed to sunlight, researchers can work out how long it has been sitting in the dark underground. Applied to the sediment surrounding the engraved ochre, this approach pinned the layers and the treasures within them to their remarkable age. The stone could not announce its own birthday, but the dirt it was buried in kept the receipt. To appreciate why that number landed like a thunderclap, you have to know what came before it in the textbooks. For generations, the grand origin of human art was located firmly in Europe, in the famous painted caves whose walls dance with bison and horses and the outlines of human hands. Those works are genuinely breathtaking and genuinely ancient, dating back tens of thousands of years, and for a long time they let Europe quietly claim the title of birthplace of the artistic mind. The Blombos engraving did not just challenge that claim, it demolished it. The little African stone predates those celebrated cave paintings by an enormous margin, pushing the firm evidence for symbolic, designed on purpose human expression back tens of thousands of years earlier than anyone had dared to assume, and back to the continent where, as we have already seen, everything else about us began too. The cradle of the body turned out to be the cradle of the imagination as well. The engraved ochre was not even a lonely fluke. Nearby in the same cave, researchers turned up something that effectively settles any lingering doubt about what these people were up to. They found what can only be described as an artist workstation, a kit for making paint. There were the raw lumps of ochre, there were the stones used to grind it into fine powder, and most tellingly there were shells that had served as containers in which the ochre powder had been mixed with other ingredients and a binding liquid to produce a workable coloured paste. In other words, these were not people who stumbled on a pretty stone and idly scratched it. These were people who understood a process, who gathered specific materials, prepared them in a particular sequence, and manufactured paint on purpose, presumably to apply it to something. They had, in the most literal sense, a recipe. It is the oldest known evidence of human beings deliberately producing a substance for the sake of decoration and meaning, and it speaks of minds that planned several steps ahead toward a goal that had nothing to do with the next meal. The paint kit was not the end of the surprises either. The same cave gave up something that pushes the story from craft into something deeper, into communication and identity. Among the finds were small sea snail shells, each one carefully pierced with a hole and showing the telltale wear of having been strung together and worn against the body, some still carrying faint traces of pigment. In plain terms, these were beads, jewellery, personal ornaments, threaded onto a cord and worn, tens of thousands of years ago, by people on that southern shore. And ornaments are never just decoration. A bead worn on the body sends a message to everyone who sees it, marking the wearer as part of a group, or of a certain standing, or simply as someone who chose to adorn themselves in a particular way. To wear a symbol so that others will read it is a profoundly modern act of mind. It means caring how you are seen, having a sense of self that can be displayed, and living in a society where such signals are understood. These were not creatures merely enduring existence. They were individuals presenting themselves to one another, which is a thing we like to imagine we invented, and very much did not. As if to remove any remaining doubt, the same site later yielded something even more direct, a discovery that made headlines around the world. On a small flake of stone, researchers identified a pattern of fine lines drawn deliberately with a pointed piece of ochre, used much like a crayon, the strokes crossing one another in a careful arrangement strikingly similar to the engraved design. This was not scratched into the surface but drawn onto it with pigment, which makes it, by a wide margin, one of the oldest known drawings ever made by a human hand, dating back around 73,000 years. Take a moment with that. Long before the first city, the first field, the first written word, someone sat on that coast, picked up a piece of soft red mineral, and drew a pattern on a stone, for reasons we will never fully recover but can absolutely recognise, because the impulse behind it is the same one that has guided every doodling hand in every dull meeting since. The desire to make a mark, just to make it, turns out to be staggeringly ancient. It helps to understand what ochre actually is, because at first glance someone could object that grinding up a mineral is just practical chemistry, not art. Ochre is a soft, iron-rich earth that ranges in colour from yellow to deep red, and people did indeed find genuinely useful things to do with it. It can serve as an ingredient in glue for fixing stone points to handles. It may have been rubbed on skin as a guard against the sun and biting insects, and it played a role in treating animal hides. So yes, in principle, a lump of ochre could simply be a useful supply, but that practical resume is exactly what makes the engraved piece so telling. Nobody needs to carve a careful pattern of crisscrossing lines into their glue. Decorating a functional material with a deliberate geometric design serves no practical purpose whatsoever, which is precisely the point. The usefulness of ochre is the control group, and the engraving is the experiment that breaks it. The moment a person took a substance they could have simply used, and instead chose to mark it with a meaningful pattern, they crossed a line no purely practical creature ever crosses, into the realm of the symbol for its own sake. That is the line that separates this behaviour from everything an animal does, and it is worth stating plainly, because it is the whole point of the cave. A creature scratching for food, fleeing a predator, or building a nest is solving an immediate problem of survival. A creature grinding a mineral, mixing it into paint, and engraving a careful geometric pattern onto a stone is doing none of those things. It gains nothing edible, nothing safer, nothing warmer. It is pure abstraction, the making of a symbol purely because the symbol matters to the mind that makes it. To bother with art at all, a being has to have risen, at least in that moment, above the relentless grind of staying alive, to have a little room in its head for meaning rather than mere survival. The people of Blombos had that room. They are the earliest individuals we can point to and say, with confidence, that they were not just surviving the world but interpreting it. There is a sobering footnote to all of this that the archaeologists are always quick to raise, and it should reshape how you imagine the whole period. What survives for us to find is only ever the durable stuff, the stone, the bone, the fired clay, the things stubborn enough to outlast 100,000 years in the ground. Everything soft and beautiful and fleeting has vanished without the faintest trace. If these people painted their bodies, and the artist's kit strongly suggests they did, that paint washed off and disappeared. If they wove ornaments, braided their hair into elaborate styles, threaded feathers and dyed fibres and decorated their clothing, all of it rotted away into nothing within a few short seasons of being made. The engraved stone in the Cape Town Museum is not the sum total of their creativity. It is the tiny, accidental, near-indestructible fragment that happened to survive. A single surviving page torn from a vast book that has otherwise crumbled to dust. For every symbolic object we recover, there were surely countless others, richer and more elaborate, that the centuries quietly erased. We are not looking at the full picture of the ancient imagination. We are looking at the one corner of it tough enough not to decay. It would be a mistake, too, to imagine this single cave as a lone flash of brilliance in an otherwise blank continent, a one-off genius surrounded by emptiness. It was nothing of the kind. Other sites scattered across southern Africa have turned up their own traces of the same awakening mind, including fragments of ostrich eggshell, used as water containers, carefully engraved with neat repeating geometric patterns of their own. Different places, different communities, the same unmistakable urge to impose pattern and meaning onto the world. This is exactly what we should expect if, as discussed earlier, the symbolic mind came up gradually across the continent, rather than switching on in a single spot. Blombos is not the exception that proves humanity was clever in one lucky corner. It is the best preserved example of something that was quietly happening in many places at once, the slow, continent-wide dawning of a species that had begun to think in symbols. So we can now say something rather grand and entirely justified. Art, the act of making a mark that carries meaning beyond mere use, was not a late European invention bestowed on a waiting world. It was born in Africa, on a windswept southern shore, in the hands of people who had already been carrying the seed of the symbolic mind for ages before they began their long walk across the planet. The body came from this continent, the family came from this continent, and now the imagination joins the list. Everything that makes us recognizably human, the shared blood, the modern face, the talking mind, and the urge to create beauty for its own sake, traces back to the same extraordinary source. But the people of that ancient coast, and of the grasslands and river valleys behind it, did not live in a fixed and gentle world that would politely leave them alone to make their paint and tell their stories. The continent that had shaped them was about to start shaping them again, and not gently. The very climate that made certain regions green and generous was already locked into vast, slow cycles that would, in time, transform lush hunting grounds into barren waste and force whole populations to pick up and move toward the few places where water still ran. The next great chapter of the human story would not be written by the mind alone. It would be dictated in large part by the weather and by a green and living landscape that was destined to turn to sand. The same forces that had once sculpted the body in the shifting valleys of the deep past were still very much at work, indifferent to how clever or creative their handiwork had become. A talking, painting, ornament-wearing people were about to discover that all their accumulated knowledge could not argue with a drying sky, and that survival would again come down to the oldest question of all, which is simply where the water goes when the rains decide to leave. To understand what the drying sky was about to do, you first have to swallow a fact that sounds like a misprint. The Sahara, the largest hot desert on the planet, an ocean of sand and rock the size of a continent where almost nothing lives, was once green. Not green in the way an optimist might describe a patch of scrub, but properly, lushly green. A vast savanna laced with lakes and rivers, grazed by enormous herds and dotted with the camps of people who never wanted for water. The endless dunes that today swallow the occasional unlucky traveller were, in the recent past, a thriving and watery world. If you find that hard to picture, you are in excellent company, because for a long time nobody believed it either, until the desert itself left a confession painted on a wall. Deep inside that desert, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest blade of grass, in a region so remote and so hostile that reaching it is a genuine expedition, there is a rock shelter whose walls are covered in painted human figures. And the figures are doing something that, in their current surroundings, borders on the absurd. They are swimming. Limbs outstretched, bodies tilted as if gliding through water, they float across the stone in the unmistakable posture of people enjoying a dip, in the middle of one of the driest places on Earth, where the idea of a swim is roughly as practical as packing a surfboard for a trip to the moon. The site has become famous as the Cave of Swimmers, and the joke of its name is also its whole meaning. Nobody paints swimmers in a place with no water. Those ancient artists were not fantasizing. They were drawing what they saw, which means that when the paint was fresh, there was water to swim in. The way the site came to light is a small adventure in itself. It was stumbled upon in the early 1930s by a European explorer crisscrossing that brutal expanse of desert, the kind of restless figure who spent his days mapping blank spots on the chart purely because they were blank. Picking his way through a maze of remote rock formations far from any settlement, he came upon the painted shelter and its impossible swimmers, and the find caused a quiet sensation among those who heard of it. Here was hard evidence, in pigment on stone, that the most lifeless desert imaginable had once cradled people splashing about in open water. It is a fittingly strange origin for such a discovery, that a place documenting a drowned green world was located by a man wandering through the sand that had buried it. This is the thing that makes that art so quietly astonishing. It is not decoration so much as a documentary, a first-hand report from a world that has since completely vanished. The people who made it lived alongside lakes deep enough to swim across, and the wider record of the region backs them up in spectacular fashion. Where there is now only baking sand, there were once hippos wallowing in the shallows, crocodiles lurking in the rivers, and giraffes ambling across grassy plains. Picture that for a moment. A landscape that today cannot keep a lizard comfortable was once busy with the kind of wildlife you would now have to travel deep into other parts of Africa to see. The Cave of Swimmers is a snapshot of that lost paradise, taken by eyewitnesses and pinned to a rock wall where the desert eventually closed in around it like a slowly shutting door. The painted swimmers are far from the only witnesses either. The desert is hiding a whole drowned geography just beneath its surface, and modern tools have learned to read it. Out under the dunes lie the dried beds of ancient lakes, some of them once enormous, including a vanished body of water that ranks among the largest lakes the world has ever held, now nothing but a ghostly outline traced across the sand. Scientists peering through the desert with radar that can see beneath the surface have mapped the channels of great rivers that once flowed where there is now only baking emptiness, entire river systems that dried up and were swallowed whole. Dig in the right spots and you turn up the fossilized bones of fish and the shells of freshwater creatures lying improbably in the heart of the driest land on Earth, like seashells found on a mountaintop. The evidence is overwhelming and slightly eerie. The Sahara is not an eternal wasteland that has always been dead. It is a fresh corpse of a living landscape, and the body is barely cold. So the obvious and rather urgent question is, what on earth happened? How does a green and generous savanna full of water and life turn into the most punishing desert on the planet? And the answer, satisfyingly, has almost nothing to do with anything the people living there did, and almost everything to do with the way our planet wobbles through space. This is the part of the story that most retellings skip, and it is a shame, because it is genuinely one of the most elegant pieces of science attached to the whole human saga. The Earth, as it turns, does not spin like a perfectly balanced top. It wobbles, slowly and steadily, the way a spinning top begins to lean and circle as it loses a little momentum, except the Earth takes around 20,000 years to complete one of these grand wobbles. This slow change gradually alters the precise way sunlight falls on different parts of the world across the seasons, and that, in turn, has an enormous effect on the great belts of rain that sweep across the globe. There is a vast seasonal rain system, the monsoon, that delivers water to the tropics, and where exactly it reaches depends on how the sunlight is hitting the planet. During one phase of the long wobble, the configuration was just right to drag that band of monsoon rain much further north than it sits today, pulling soaking seasonal downpours up and over the region we now call the Sahara. The rains came year after year, century after century, and the desert was not a desert at all. It was watered from the sky on a schedule, and it responded by turning green. This wet phase has a suitably grand name. the African humid period, and it ran from roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. For thousands of years, an area that we think of as the very definition of lifeless wasteland was instead a well-watered land of lakes, marshes, grasslands, and abundant game, perfectly habitable and, by all evidence, quite comfortably inhabited. It was not a brief fluke either. It lasted longer than all of recorded history has lasted so far, which puts the impermanence of our own familiar map into slightly uncomfortable perspective. The world we take for granted is just the current frame of a very long film. Nor was the Cave of Swimmers the only gallery left behind by this lost world. Elsewhere in the heart of the desert, on the walls and overhangs of remote highland plateaus, there survive vast open-air collections of rock art, thousands upon thousands of painted and engraved images stretching across the ages. They show a world teeming with life and people, herds of long-horned cattle being driven across the plains, figures dancing, hunting, gathering, and going about ordinary days, the whole bustling routine of communities who lived comfortably in a place that would kill an unprepared visitor today within hours. Taken together, these galleries form one of the richest records of prehistoric life anywhere on the planet, and every one of them is now stranded in arid nothingness, a museum of a green age curated by the very desert that erased it. The art outlasted the world it depicted, which is either deeply poignant or quietly hilarious, depending on the hour at which you consider it. Then the wobble continued on its patient way, as wobbles do, and the orbital configuration that had been so generous slowly shifted out of alignment. It is worth noting that this slow wobble is not the only rhythm the planet keeps. The Earth's journey through space is governed by a whole family of these long overlapping cycles, slow changes in the tilt of its axis and the shape of its path around the Sun, each ticking on its own enormous timescale of tens of thousands of years. Working together and against one another, these cycles are the deep metronome behind the great climate swings of our world, the same beat that drives ice ages to advance and retreat. The greening and the death of the Sahara were simply one local performance of this planetary clockwork, a desert keeping time with the heavens, whether anyone living in it understood the music or not. There is also a cruel twist in how the drying actually unfolded, because landscapes do not always fade away gently in proportion to the change pushing on them. Sometimes they hold on, and then collapse all at once. A region thick with vegetation actually helps make its own rain, the plants returning moisture to the air, the green cover keeping the ground cool and damp, the whole living system propping itself up. As the rains slowly weakened, the Sahara clung to its greenery for a while through exactly this kind of self-support. But there came a point where too much had been lost. The plants could no longer sustain the conditions they needed, and the whole arrangement gave way in a rush, tipping from grassland to desert far faster than the gentle orbital nudge alone would suggest. In some areas, the flip from living land to dead sand may have taken only a few centuries, a blink by geological standards, leaving the people there to watch their world unravel within a handful of generations. It was not a slow fade so much as a long pause followed by a sudden fall. The monsoon band that had been hauled so far north began to slide back south toward its present position, and the reliable rains that had kept the savannah alive started to fail. This is where the story turns from idyllic to grim, though in slow motion. The drying was not necessarily instantaneous, but across a span of centuries the water retreated, the lakes shrank and turned to salt and then to dust, the grasses withered, the game moved on or died off, and the green world the Cave of Swimmers had recorded simply ceased to exist. In its place spread the immense, arid, and increasingly uninhabitable desert that we know today. An area larger than many continents flipped, within the lifetime of a civilization, from a place that supported abundant life to a place that actively repels it. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the great environmental catastrophes in the human past, and absolutely nobody was at fault. The planet simply leaned the other way. What makes this more than a tragic nature story is that the people living through it were not passive victims wandering around in confusion. They were watching, measuring, and trying to understand their changing world with a sophistication that tends to surprise people. Out in the desert of southern Egypt sits a remarkable arrangement of standing stones, deliberately placed by human hands somewhere around 6,800 years ago. This is Nabta Playa, and it is one of the oldest known structures anywhere on Earth built to track the heavens. The stones were not scattered at random. Several of them appear to have been aligned with key positions of the sun across the year, in particular the moment of the summer solstice. which in that region happened to herald the arrival of the precious seasonal rains. In other words, these were people who had figured out how to read the sky as a calendar, marking the turning of the year in stone so they would know when the life-giving water was due. There is more at this site than the sky-watching stones, and the rest of it reveals just how central cattle had become to these desert communities. Alongside the alignments, archaeologists found megaliths hauled into place, and, strikingly, the carefully arranged burials of cattle, animals interred with a ceremony usually reserved for honoured members of a community. People did not bury a cow with that kind of care unless the animal meant something far beyond a future meal. To these herders, cattle were wealth, security, and very probably the focus of belief and ritual, beasts woven so deeply into the fabric of life that they accompanied their keepers into death. Nabta Playa, then, is not merely an early observatory. It is a window into a society that organised its whole existence around its herds and around the rhythm of the rains those herds depended on, watching the heavens and honouring their animals with equal seriousness. It is worth sitting with how impressive that is. These were not settled scholars in a comfortable city with time on their hands. They were herders living in a harsh and changing land, and yet they had observed the heavens carefully enough, over enough years, to notice that the sun returned to the same spot on the horizon at a particular time, and that this moment reliably predicted the rains. Then they did something only a planning, abstract thinking creature would bother with. They lugged heavy stones into position to record that knowledge permanently, building a tool that would outlive every single one of them. It is one of humanity's earliest attempts to pin down time itself, to impose order on the calendar, and it was raised in the African desert by people whose names are utterly lost to us. Long before the famous monuments we will come to shortly, communities here were already counting the seasons and watching the stars, all of which establishes the real lead character of this part of the story, and it is not a king or a hero. It is the climate. Far too often the natural world gets treated as a quiet backdrop against which human drama plays out, a painted scenery flat behind the actors. In the African story it is nothing of the sort. The climate is the director, calling the shots, deciding where people can live and where they cannot, and ultimately herding entire populations from one part of the map to another with the irresistible logic of where the water happens to be. And as the Green Sahara died, that logic pointed in one unmistakable direction. As the desert tightened its grip and the scattered lakes and rivers dried up one by one, there remained, cutting straight through the expanding wasteland, a single great ribbon of reliable water that never failed. The drying of the Sahara did not just destroy a world, it funneled its refugees toward the one place that could still sustain them, and in doing so it set the stage for everything that came after. That ribbon of water was the river, and the people the desert pushed toward it did not arrive empty-handed or empty-headed. They came with a way of life that had been quietly developing out on those vanishing grasslands, and it changed everything. For most of the long story we have followed, humans got their food the old-fashioned way, by hunting it down and gathering it up wherever it happened to grow, taking what nature offered and moving on when it ran short. But somewhere around 10,000 years ago, across parts of Africa and the neighbouring Near East, people began doing something genuinely revolutionary. Instead of merely chasing animals, they started keeping them, managing herds of cattle, controlling their breeding, and treating them as a walking, renewable larder. The archaeologist John Hawkes has made the point that the continent we keep calling the cradle of humanity deserves a second title as well, as a cradle of the herding and farming life. The place that produced the human body and the human mind also helped pioneer the human habit of producing food, rather than simply finding it. It is hard to overstate how thoroughly cattle came to dominate the way these people saw the world, and the pattern runs so deep that echoes of it survive across parts of Africa to this very day. For a herding society, cattle are not merely livestock. They are the bank account, the dowry, the measure of a person's standing, the currency of marriages and alliances and reputations, a form of wealth that walks, breeds, and can be counted at a glance. A man with many cattle was, quite simply, a rich and important man, and his herd announced it to everyone for miles. This is a profoundly different relationship with animals than the one most modern people have with the contents of a supermarket cooler. The herd was identity and security braided into one, the difference between a family that would thrive and one that would not, and the obsessive care lavished on these animals, all the way to giving them solemn burials, makes perfect sense once you see them as the very foundation of a person's place in the world. This was not a minor lifestyle tweak. Domesticating animals is one of the hinge moments in the entire human experience, because it fundamentally changes a person's relationship with the future. A hunter eats today and worries about tomorrow when tomorrow arrives. A herder owns tomorrow's meals on the hoof, walking around in front of them, a stockpile of food and milk and hide and labour that reproduces itself. It is the difference between living hand to mouth and having for the first time something like savings, and out on the green Sahara before it died, this way of life flourished. Between roughly 4,800 and 4,200 years before the Common Era, more than 1,000 years before the Kingdom of Egypt that everyone has heard of even existed, a sophisticated society of cattle-herding nomads was already thriving to the west of the Great River, moving across the grasslands with enormous herds in tow. They were, in a real sense, wealthy, their riches measured not in gold but in living, breathing livestock. There is a fascinating biological footnote to the herding life that shows just how deeply this new way of living reached, right down into the genes. Cattle do not only provide meat and hide, they provide milk, a renewable daily source of nourishment that does not require killing the animal at all, which is a rather better deal for everyone involved, the cow included. The catch is that, for most of human history, adults simply could not digest milk properly. The ability to break down the sugar in milk normally switched off after infancy, since no adult had ever needed it. But among populations that took up dairying in earnest, milk-drinking herders whose survival could hinge on that liquid in lean seasons, a genetic change began to spread, one that kept the milk-digesting machinery switched on for life. Those who could stomach milk as adults had an edge, and so, over not very many generations, the trait became common in cattle-keeping communities, including herding peoples of Eastern Africa. It is one of the clearest examples we have of culture reshaping the human body itself. People changed how they lived, and their bodies, given a few thousand years, obligingly changed to match. The herd did not just fill the belly, it quietly edited the gut. Then the rains failed, as we have seen, and the grass these herds depended on turned to dust. The herders faced a simple and brutal choice: follow the water or perish with the land, and so they did what people in such situations have always done. They packed up and moved toward the one place that still had it. Drifting in from the drying plains, these cattle people converged on the lush valley of the Great River, and there they settled, mingled, and put down roots. They became, over generations, the ancestors of the two great cultures that would rise along that river, the people of Egypt to the north, and the people of the lands further upstream that we will come to know as Nubia. The famous River Valley civilization was not handed down from the sky, or imported from somewhere grander. It was assembled from the refugees of a dying desert, who carried their herds, their skills, and their hard-won knowledge of the seasons into the one green corridor the catastrophe had left them. These newcomers did not transform into a grand kingdom overnight, and the centuries between their arrival and the famous Age of Monuments were anything but empty. Along the banks of the river, a string of increasingly sophisticated communities grew up and flourished, each more settled and more organized than the last. They made fine pottery, ground minerals into cosmetics on carved stone pallets, traded goods up and down the valley and beyond, and buried their dead with growing quantities of carefully chosen possessions. Most tellingly, those burials grew steadily less equal over time. Early on, people were laid to rest with much the same modest assortment of goods, but as the generations passed, some graves began to fill with finer and more abundant treasures, while others stayed plain. That widening gap, written in the contents of the tombs, is the unmistakable signature of a society sorting itself into ranks, of wealth and status pooling in certain hands. The river kingdom that would later dazzle the world did not appear from nowhere. It was slowly assembled, grave by grave and generation by generation, out of these quietly stratifying valley communities. And what a corridor it was! The river running through that valley did something for the people gathered along it that no amount of cleverness on their part could have arranged. Once a year, with reliable regularity, it would swell and overflow its banks, spreading across the surrounding flatlands and then receding to leave behind a fresh layer of dark, fertile silt, rich mud carried down from distant highlands and deposited like an annual gift of free fertilizer. This yearly flood turned a thin strip of land in the middle of a merciless desert into some of the most productive farmland in the ancient world, a green river cutting through the dead sand. In ages to come, this same valley would feed empires far beyond its borders, earning a reputation as the breadbasket of the wider Mediterranean world. For the people first settling there, it meant something more immediate and more transformative. It meant that the land, properly worked, produced more food than the workers themselves needed to eat. What made this flood such an extraordinary gift was not just its richness, but its sheer dependability. Other great rivers that nurtured early societies elsewhere in the world were notoriously temperamental, prone to violent, unpredictable floods that could wipe out a settlement as easily as nourish it, the kind of capricious neighbour you can never quite trust. The river of this valley was different. Its annual rise was so regular, so reliably timed, that people could plan their entire year around it with confidence, planting and harvesting in step with a flood that arrived almost like clockwork. That reliability did more than fill granaries. It seems to have shaped the very outlook of the culture that grew up along the banks, fostering a settled, orderly and rather optimistic civilization, one that came to expect the universe to behave in dependable patterns. When the river that feeds you keeps its promises every single year, you tend to build a worldview around the idea that the cosmos, on the whole, can be counted on. It is a striking thought that the temperament of a civilization might be set in part by the punctuality of a river. That single fact, the surplus, is the quiet engine of everything we usually call civilization, and it deserves to be spelled out because it is so easy to miss. As long as every able-bodied person in a community has to spend essentially all their time finding or producing food, nobody can specialize in anything else. There is no spare labor, no spare time, and no room for anyone to become anything other than a full-time provider of meals. But the moment the land yields a genuine surplus, the moment a farmer can grow enough to feed not only their own family, but several other people besides, something extraordinary becomes possible. A portion of the population is suddenly freed from the daily grind of food production, and those freed hands do not sit idle. They become potters, weavers, toolmakers, traders, builders, priests, and administrators. They become specialists. Society begins to grow layers it never had before, dividing into those who grow the food and those who do other things entirely, which is also, less comfortably, the origin of the haves and the have-nots. The surplus that fed the first artisans also planted the seeds of the first social classes, because once there is wealth beyond mere survival, the question of who controls it is never far behind. It would be tidy to call all this straightforward progress, a clean upgrade from a hard life to an easy one, but the truth is a good deal more mixed and worth saying plainly. Settling down in dense communities and living off a handful of staple crops was, in several respects, a step backward for the ordinary body. Roaming foragers had eaten a wonderfully varied diet and rarely stayed anywhere long enough to foul it, whereas crowded settlements full of people and animals living cheek by jowl became, unfortunately, excellent breeding grounds for disease. Diets narrowed, teeth suffered, backs bent under new kinds of labour, and being packed together brought a whole catalogue of fresh miseries that scattered hunters had largely avoided. For the average person, the dawn of settled life was not obviously the better bargain. What it did do, decisively, was support far more people in one place, and free a fortunate few from the daily search for food, and it is from that fortunate freed minority, not from any improvement in the common lot, that the towering achievements of civilization would spring. Progress, as ever, kept an uneven set of books. We can actually see these increasingly settled, increasingly sorted people through the things they were buried with, and the objects they chose to take to the grave reveal a culture far richer and more vain, in the best sense, than the dusty image of prehistory usually allows. Among the goods recovered from ancient burial pits in the river valley, some of them well over 6,000 years old, are items that need no expert to interpret. There are combs, including beautifully made combs dating back to around 3,600 years before the Common Era, with widely spaced teeth shaped in exactly the way required to groom and style tightly curled African hair. These are not crude implements. They are designed, specialized grooming tools, which tells you that the people using them cared a great deal about how their hair looked and had the leisure and the craftsmanship to do something about it. Built out from a single comb, and an entire vanished world of style and status comes into focus. The evidence gathered from such objects alongside art and preserved remains points to a vibrant and elaborate culture of personal appearance. People dyed and decorated themselves, used reddish plant-based colouring on their hair and skin, wove in additional strands to lengthen and thicken their styles, piled their hair into intricate arrangements, and even shaped it into bold, upright crests not so different from the dramatic styles we tend to assume are a much more recent invention. As we touched on earlier, marking the body with meaning was already an ancient human habit, but here it has clearly blossomed into something organised and socially loaded. Hairstyle was not just fashion. It was a language, signalling who you were, where you stood, and what group you belonged to, written in curls and crests and colour for everyone to read. It was identity made visible, and a society wealthy enough in time and skill to bother making it. There is a deeper point hiding in those elaborate styles that connects right back to the surplus we have been discussing. An intricate hairstyle is expensive, not in money, but in time. And time is exactly what a society only gains once it produces more food than it strictly needs. Piling, braiding, dyeing, and arranging hair into something elaborate takes hours, often more than one person's hands, which means somebody had the leisure to sit and be styled, and somebody else had the freedom to do the styling rather than scratch in a field all day. Elaborate grooming is, in a sense, leisure made visible, a quiet boast that the wearer belonged to a world with hours to spare. And because such styles took effort and skill, they naturally became markers of who mattered. A person of standing could announce it without saying a word, simply by appearing with hair that obviously took half a day and several helpers to produce, while the specialised combs and tools recovered from the ground hint that dressing hair was already becoming a craft in its own right, a skill some people practiced on behalf of others. The humble comb, in other words, is not a trivial curiosity tucked in among the grander finds. It is a small, sharp piece of evidence for a society with spare time, sorted ranks, recognised specialists, and a keen sense of appearance, every one of which is a hallmark of the complex world taking shape along the river. So in this one stretch of the story, three of the deepest threads of human history twist together into a single rope. The climate, swinging on its slow orbital wobble, dried a paradise into a desert and drove its people toward a river. The herding way of life, carried in from those dying grasslands, met that river's astonishing fertility and produced food beyond mere need. And that surplus, in turn, freed people to specialise, to build, to adorn themselves, and inevitably to stratify into the layered society of rich and poor, ruler and ruled. Climate shaped the land shaped the food, and the food shaped the very structure of human society. The pieces were now in place for something the world had never seen before, a dense, settled, wealthy, and sharply divided population gathered along a single river. And a society like that, with its surpluses to count, its property to track, and its growing ranks of rulers eager to keep hold of what they had, was about to face a brand new problem, the problem of how to record, remember, and control it all, which would summon into existence one of the most powerful tools humanity has ever devised. A society that has learned to produce more than it eats very quickly runs into a problem that sounds almost comically dull, but turns out to be one of the great turning points in human history. It is the problem of keeping track of things. Once a community is large, settled, and stratified, with granaries to fill, herds to count, fields to tax, workers to organise, and rulers who very much want to know exactly what they own, the sheer volume of information involved begins to overwhelm the only tool people had ever used to store it, which was the human memory. And memory, for all its charms, is a famously unreliable filing system. It forgets, it embellishes, it dies along with the person carrying it, and it has an awkward tendency to remember debts rather differently depending on which end of the debt you happen to be on. A growing, wealthy, complicated society simply cannot run on the honour system and a good recollection. Sooner or later it needs a way to pin information down outside the human head, somewhere it will sit still and stay honest. What that society needed, in short, was writing, and the astonishing thing is that we can now point to roughly where and when it first appeared. For a long time, the textbooks were quite confident on this point, and quite wrong. The standard tale held that writing was first invented far to the northeast, in the land between two rivers that we call Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay and thereby supposedly gave the world its first script. It was a tidy story, repeated so often it hardened into common knowledge, and for generations almost nobody questioned that the written word had been handed to humanity from that particular corner of the ancient world. Then, as so often happens in this story, the ground in Africa quietly produced something that forced everyone to reach for an eraser. The setting was Abydos, an ancient and deeply sacred site in the desert some 480 kilometers up the river from the modern city of Cairo, a place that would later become one of the holiest spots in the whole civilization, thick with tombs and temples. In the late 1980s, a German archaeological team, working under the direction of an excavator named Günther Dreyer, was carefully picking through a very old burial there, a tomb known by the dry catalogue label U-J. The grave belonged to someone important, almost certainly one of the early rulers of the region, from the closing centuries of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, a powerful figure from the shadowy age before the famous line of kings most people have heard of. The occupant is sometimes tentatively identified with the name Scorpion, which is a tremendously good name for a mysterious early king, and which we should probably enjoy while gently remembering that the identification is far from certain. He was in any case a person of considerable wealth, buried with the kind of goods that signal real power. It is worth pausing on Abydos itself, because the location is no accident and adds a layer of meaning to the find. In the centuries that followed, this stretch of desert would become one of the most sacred places in the entire civilization, revered as ground intimately tied to the god of the dead and the promise of life beyond it, a destination so holy that people for thousands of years would arrange to be buried there or to have memorials raised in their name. The earliest rulers chose this spot for their tombs long before all that fame, and in doing so, they helped make it holy. The tomb in question was no simple pit either. It was a substantial structure of multiple chambers, and packed within it, alongside the little tags, were the trappings of serious wealth, including hundreds of large jars that had once held wine, a great many of them imported from lands well beyond the river valley. That detail alone speaks volumes. Here was a ruler rich enough to import luxury goods by the boatload from distant regions, and the small tags, it seems, were partly there to record exactly where all that imported bounty had come from. The first writing was not just bookkeeping in the abstract. It was the paperwork of a long-distance luxury supply chain, which is a sentence that could just as easily describe a modern shipping warehouse. Among those goods were about 150 small tags, little labels made of bone and ivory, each one no bigger than a postage stamp and each one carved with tiny symbols. At first glance, there is nothing obviously earth-shattering about a scattering of decorated chips of bone, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world to file them away as minor ornaments, the prehistoric equivalent of novelty fridge magnets. But the symbols on them were not decoration. As the researchers studied the markings, it became clear that these little signs were doing something far more sophisticated. They were recording information. They were, in the most literal sense, writing, and the date attached to them landed somewhere around 3,250 years before the Common Era, which placed them at the very dawn of the written word, every bit as early as anything Mesopotamia could offer, and by some readings of the evidence even a touch earlier. It is worth being clear about why this counts as writing when, as we saw much earlier in this story, people had been carving meaningful symbols onto objects for tens of thousands of years already. An engraved pattern, however deliberate, carries a vague sense of meaning, but it does not encode actual language. It cannot be read aloud as specific words. What makes these little tags categorically different, the thing that earns them the title of true writing, is that their signs stood for particular words and sounds drawn from a real spoken language. They were not just meaningful. They were legible, a code that a trained reader could translate back into specific speech. That is the leap. It is the difference between drawing a picture that gives you a feeling and writing a sentence that says a precise thing, and crossing that gap is one of the rarest and most consequential things our species has ever managed. It would be dishonest to pretend that every scholar threw up their hands and instantly agreed, because that is simply not how these things go. The claim that this was the earliest writing in the world set off a perfectly healthy academic squabble that rumbles on in some corners to this day. Some specialists argue that the marks between the two rivers to the northeast still hold the edge. Others quibble over whether the very earliest of these African signs qualify as full writing, or as something just short of it, and the precise dates get pushed and pulled with every fresh analysis. None of that is a weakness in the story. It is how careful knowledge actually works, through argument and revision rather than tidy proclamation. But the central point has held up firmly through all the wrangling. Whatever the exact order of the photo finish, the people of the river valley were unmistakably among the first humans anywhere to invent true writing, doing it independently and astonishingly early, and that alone overturned a tidy old certainty that had stood unquestioned for far too long. Now for the part that tends to puncture every romantic notion people have about the invention of writing. You might imagine that humanity, upon developing the miraculous power to freeze language in physical form, would have immediately reached for something grand. Poetry, perhaps. Prayers to the gods. The deep thoughts of great minds preserved for the ages. The reality is gloriously, almost insultingly mundane. The tiny tags from that tomb were not love letters or hymns or philosophy. They were, for all practical purposes, shipping labels. Each one had a small hole bored through it, so it could be tied onto a bag, a jar, or a bundle of goods, and the symbols recorded the sort of thing a warehouse clerk would care about, namely what the item was, how much of it there was, who it belonged to, and where it had come from. The oldest writing in this part of the world, one of the foundational achievements of civilization, was essentially a system of inventory tags. Humanity's first use of its godlike new power to capture language for eternity was to label the boss's wine jars. It is the kind of detail that should be carved over the entrance of every accounting office on Earth. But once the laughter dies down, that humble origin turns out to be the most revealing thing about the whole business, because it tells you exactly what writing was for and who it was for. Writing did not bubble up from poets longing to share their souls. It was summoned into existence by the cold, practical needs of power. A ruler who controls vast stores of grain, herds of animals, and the labour of thousands of people has a desperate need to keep track of all of it, to know what is owed, what has been collected, what has been spent, and who is holding out on him. Memory cannot manage that at scale, and a ruler certainly cannot personally watch every storeroom. Writing solved the problem beautifully. It let authority extend its reach far beyond the range of a single pair of eyes, recording obligations and possessions in a form that could not conveniently forget. From its very first scratch, then, writing was a technology of administration and control, a tool for the powerful to keep firm hold of what they had and to squeeze out what they were owed. It was bound up with property, taxation, and command from the beginning, which is a rather less inspiring origin than the one in the storybooks, but a far more honest one. If you find it deflating that the written word began as accountancy, take some comfort in the fact that this was apparently a universal pattern, not a local embarrassment. The famous early writing far to the northeast appears to have grown out of an accounting habit too. Long before they wrote anything, people there had been using small clay tokens of various shapes to stand for goods, one shape for a measure of grain, another for a head of livestock, and so on, sealing collections of these counters inside clay containers to record a transaction. Over time, pressing the tokens onto the surface of the clay and then simply drawing the shapes proved easier than enclosing the objects themselves, and from that bookkeeping shorthand a writing system gradually emerged. So in two separate corners of the ancient world, working entirely independently, humanity arrived at writing by the same unglamorous road. Nobody, it seems, invents the written word to compose sonnets. They invent it to settle accounts, and the poetry, the prayers, and the philosophy all have to wait politely in line behind the receipts. This also quietly settled an old argument and rearranged the map of human achievement in the process. The long-held assumption that writing was a gift bestowed by one single far-off birthplace, from which it spread to everyone else, took a serious blow from those little African tags. They demonstrated that the people of the river valley had developed their own full system of writing on their own terms, in their own way, at essentially the same moment as anyone else, and quite possibly a bit before. This was not a borrowed idea, copied from a more advanced neighbour. It was an independent invention, worked out from scratch by a civilization solving its own problems with its own ingenuity. The written word, it turns out, was not handed down to Africa from somewhere more sophisticated. Africa was there at the very creation of it, pen in hand, or rather carving tool in hand, right alongside everyone else. And that matters more than it might first appear, because the independent invention of true writing is one of the rarest events in the entire human record. For all the thousands of cultures that have existed across the planet, genuine writing seems to have been dreamed up from nothing, only a tiny handful of times in all of history, in just a few separate places that each cracked the puzzle on their own. Every other writing system on Earth, including the very letters these words are built from, ultimately descends from, or was inspired by, one of those few original sparks. Inventing writing entirely from scratch, with no example to copy, is staggeringly difficult, which is precisely why it almost never happened. To be one of the rare places that managed it independently is to belong to a very exclusive club, and the River Valley of Africa was a charter member. The other founding members are scattered across the globe and across time, a script worked out in Eastern Asia, another devised in the Americas long before any contact with the wider world, each one a separate proof that a human society under the right pressures can, very occasionally, perform this particular miracle on its own. But the list is short enough to count on your fingers with digits left over, which is a humbling thought given how many cultures have come and gone. Most peoples who ended up with writing got it the easy way, by borrowing or adapting somebody else's, the way nearly every alphabet in use today traces back through a long family tree to a handful of ancient ancestors. Actually building the thing from nothing is the rarest of feats, and Africa stands among the tiny number of places that pulled it off unaided. The genuinely clever trick at the heart of it, the thing that turned simple pictures into a true script, is worth understanding, because it is where the magic actually lives. The obvious way to start writing is to draw little pictures of things, a picture of an ox to mean an ox, a picture of the sun to mean the sun. That works fine for concrete objects, but it falls apart the instant you need to write something you cannot draw, like a name, an abstract idea, or a grammatical word. The breakthrough was to stop using pictures for what they showed and start using them for how they sounded. Imagine a system where the picture of an eye no longer means an eye at all, but instead stands for the sound of the word eye, so you could use it to spell out part of an unrelated word that happened to contain that sound. Suddenly a limited set of little pictures becomes a flexible toolkit for capturing any word in the language, sound by sound. This move, from drawing meanings to spelling sounds, is the hinge on which writing swings from a crude memory aid into a full system capable of recording anything a person can say. The early signs on those tags appear to be doing exactly this, using images for their sounds to note down things like the places goods had come from. It is a small intellectual leap to describe and an enormous one to make, and somebody on the banks of that river made it. Hand in hand with the signs for words came signs for numbers, and this pairing is no coincidence at all. If your whole reason for inventing writing is to keep track of how much grain is in the granary, and how many jars of wine arrive from abroad, then a way to record quantities is not optional, it is the entire point. So the same impulse that produced the first words produced the first proper number system right alongside them, a set of marks for counting and tallying that let the record keepers note not just what they had, but precisely how much of it. Writing and arithmetic were born as twins, both children of the same accountant's need to pin down the world in exact amounts. Long before anyone used these tools to ponder the heavens or measure a field for building, they were using them to make sure nobody shorted the king his due, which remains, if we are honest, one of the most enduring applications of mathematics ever devised. Once a society possessed this tool, the consequences rippled outward in every direction, and most of them concentrated power even further into the hands of those at the top. Because here is the uncomfortable thing about a technology that only a few people can use. Reading and writing are not natural the way speech is. A child picks up talking simply by being around talkers, but writing has to be painstakingly taught, and in the ancient world the teaching was long, difficult, and available only to a select few. The result was that literacy became the jealously guarded skill of a small, privileged class of scribes, the professionals who could turn speech into marks and marks back into speech. And a scribe was an extraordinarily powerful person to be. He kept the records, he drafted the orders, he calculated the taxes, he stood at the elbow of authority as its indispensable instrument. In a world where almost nobody could read, the person who could was a gatekeeper to the entire machinery of the state. Writing did not democratize knowledge. For a very long time it did the opposite, handing yet another lever of control to the few who held the keys to it. The life of a scribe was, accordingly, a coveted one, and the people of the time knew it perfectly well. Becoming a scribe meant years of grueling schooling, memorizing hundreds upon hundreds of signs and copying texts until the hand cramped, a long and tedious apprenticeship that filtered out all but the dedicated few. But the reward at the end was enormous. A trained scribe was exempt from the back-breaking manual labour that filled most people's days, did not sweat in the fields or haul stone under the sun, and instead worked in the shade with a reed pen, close to wealth and authority. Surviving writings from the era positively gloat about this, with teachers urging their students to stick with their studies by cheerfully running down every other profession, painting the farmer, the soldier, and the labourer as miserable wretches while the scribe sits comfortable and respected. It is essentially the world's oldest surviving career advice lecture, and its core message, that you should stay in school so you do not end up doing real work, has aged remarkably well. The scribe sold his literacy the way people have sold scarce and valuable skills ever since, and a society that could not function without him made sure he was looked after. The physical form of writing then went through its own quiet revolution, and once again the great river was at the centre of it. Bone and ivory tags are all very well for the occasional label, but they are a clumsy medium for serious record-keeping, being small, hard, and tedious to carve. What the civilization needed was something cheap, plentiful, and easy to write on, and the river obligingly provided it in the form of a tall reed that grew abundantly in its marshes. By slicing the inner pith of this plant into strips, laying them in criss-crossed layers, and pressing them flat, people produced smooth, flexible sheets that could be written on quickly with ink and a reed pen, then rolled up and stored. This was a genuine information technology, a lightweight and abundant writing surface that made it practical to keep records on a vast scale, to send written messages over distances, and eventually to compose long documents of every kind. The same river that grew the food and deposited the fertile soil now grew the paper too, as if the landscape itself were quietly conspiring to make a record-keeping civilization possible. As writing settled into daily use, it also quietly split into more than one style, for the same practical reasons we juggle neat handwriting and a hurried scrawl today. The beautiful, careful picture signs that most people picture, the ones carved into temple walls and royal monuments, were the formal, dressed-up version, slow to produce and reserved for things meant to impress and endure. But no clerk tallying grain all day was going to lovingly carve a perfect little owl for every entry. So alongside the grand script there developed a faster, simpler, flowing hand for everyday business, the signs streamlined and joined for speed, scribbled with ink rather than chiselled in stone. One script was for eternity and ceremony, the other for getting the day's work done, and the gap between them is the same one that separates a wedding invitation from a shopping list. A civilization that wrote constantly needed both, the showpiece and the workhorse, and developed each to suit. With a cheap surface to write on, and a script flexible enough to capture anything, writing slowly slipped its original leash. Having been born to count grain and label jars, it gradually expanded to do everything else. In time, the same system that began as inventory tags would be used to set down laws so that rulers could declare what was permitted and forbidden, to record the deeds of kings so their glory would outlast their bodies, to preserve sacred texts and instructions for the afterlife, to write letters, contracts, medical notes, stories and complaints, and to accumulate a body of recorded knowledge that no single memory could ever hold. This is the deepest gift of writing, and the reason it changed everything. Spoken knowledge, as we discussed long ago, can be passed down and built upon, but it leaks and drifts with every retelling. Written knowledge holds still. It lets a person speak accurately across centuries to someone they will never meet, lets one generation hand the next, not a fuzzy memory, but an exact record, and lets a civilization accumulate wisdom with a permanence that talk alone could never manage. The little tags in that tomb were the first trickle of what would become an unstoppable flood. There is a subtler revolution buried inside all this that is easy to overlook, because writing did not just store information, it actually expanded what the human mind could do. The unaided brain, for all its brilliance, is a leaky and limited workspace. Try to hold a long list, a complicated calculation, or an intricate argument entirely in your head, and it slips and tangles almost at once, which is why even now people reach for a scrap of paper the moment a problem gets serious. Writing handed humanity an external memory, a place to set thoughts down, look at them, rearrange them, and build on them step by patient step without having to juggle the whole thing in the mind at once. Suddenly a person could work through problems far too big to solve in their head, keep accounts too vast to memorize, and pass a fully worked out idea to someone else exactly as it was, no fading and no drift. In a real sense, writing became an extension of the brain itself, a tool that let thought grow beyond the cramped limits of memory. It is no exaggeration to say that a great deal of what we consider advanced human thinking only became possible once the mind could lean on the page, offloading the heavy lifting onto a surface that never forgets and never gets tired. There is a final twist to the story of this particular script that is worth telling, because it shows just how fragile even the mightiest technology can be. The writing system that grew from those early signs, the elegant picture script of the river valley, served its civilization faithfully for thousands of years, longer than most languages have existed. And then, slowly it died. As the ancient world gave way to new powers, new rulers, and new ways of writing, fewer and fewer people learned the old script, until eventually the very last person who could read it passed away, and with them the knowledge simply vanished. For something like a millennium and a half, the monuments and documents of one of the greatest civilizations in human history stood covered in writing that absolutely nobody alive could understand. The words were right there, carved in stone for anyone to see, and they had become as silent as the dead who wrote them. An entire library of human achievement had been locked, and the key thrown away so thoroughly that people forgot the lock had ever opened. The key was eventually found again, and the story of its recovery is one of the great detective tales of scholarship. It hinged on a remarkable slab of stone, unearthed by chance, that happened to carry the same message written out in the old picture script alongside a second script that could still be read. By painstakingly comparing the two, a brilliant scholar named Jean-François Champollion, building on the work of others, finally cracked the code in the early 1800s, proving that the ancient signs really did spell out words and sounds, and reopening a door that had been sealed for 15 centuries. In an instant, the silent monuments began to speak again, and an entire civilization that had been mute for ages could suddenly tell its own story in its own words. It is a fitting bookend. Writing was invented on that river to make sure information would never be lost, then was itself lost for over 1,000 years, then was recovered to prove the original promise true after all. The marks really had outlasted everything, just not quite in the way their inventors expected. There is a quiet but profound boundary that writing draws across the whole human story, and we have just crossed it. Everything that came before in this account, the skulls, the cave art, the dying Sahara, the herders and their cattle, all of it reaches us second hand, reconstructed from bones and objects and clever inference, a past with no one in it whose name we can speak. The moment writing appears, that changes forever. For the first time, individual human beings start to leave us their actual names, recorded by their own hand or that of their scribes, real people we can point to and address directly across the gulf of time. The mysterious ruler in that desert tomb may well be the earliest named person in the history of this part of the world, a man whose name, or at least his royal symbol, survived him by more than 5,000 years on a few scraps of carved bone. This is the line that divides what we call prehistory from history proper, and it is not an arbitrary one. It is the difference between a past full of anonymous shapes and a past full of people, the point at which the human story stops being something we merely dig up and starts being something we can read. Writing very quickly proved its worth to power in another way, beyond the dry work of inventory, and within a couple of centuries of those first tags it was being put to spectacularly public use. Rulers began stamping their names and their triumphs onto grand ceremonial objects and monuments, carved slabs and emblems that proclaimed who the king was and what he had conquered, his royal name spelled out in the new signs for all to behold. This was writing as advertisement, as propaganda, as the permanent self-glorification of a ruler determined that his greatness should be remembered. It also became a tool for binding a sprawling realm together under a single crown, since a king who could issue written commands, record loyalty and immortalize his authority in stone held a powerful new kind of glue for welding scattered territories into one kingdom. The same technology that started life labeling the contents of a wine jar was, almost immediately, helping to forge and proclaim the unified state itself. From counting jars to crowning kings took remarkably little time, which tells you everything about whose hands this tool fell into first. We owe a strange debt in all this to the very dryness of the land. Paper made from reeds is a fragile thing, and in most parts of the world a written sheet left in the ground would rot away to nothing within a generation or two. Damp and mould making short work of it, but the arid desert air that had once doomed the green Sahara turned out to be the perfect preservative for the written word, drawing out the moisture that destroys and leaving documents intact for thousands of years. Records that would have crumbled to mush almost anywhere else survived in that dry climate to be dug up and read in our own time, preserving not just the grand proclamations of kings but the small, human, gloriously ordinary stuff, the tax accounts, the work rosters, the letters, the complaints, the scribbled notes of people going about their lives. The same harsh environment that had once driven everyone toward the river now quietly safeguarded the river civilization's memory, baking its paperwork dry and keeping it safe across the millennia. The desert took a green world away and, in a small act of compensation, handed back an unrivaled archive. So a scattering of little carved tags in a desert tomb, easy to mistake for trinkets, turned out to rewrite our understanding of when and where civilization learned to record itself, and to confirm yet again that the great foundations of the human world were being laid in Africa right alongside or ahead of everyone else. With surpluses to count, property to defend, power to enforce, and now a written language to lock all of it firmly in place, the River Kingdom held every ingredient it needed for something truly monumental. The same organized power that could tally 1,000 jars of wine and command the labor of a nation was about to point itself at a far grander ambition, and turn the wealth of the land and the muscle of its people toward raising structures so vast and so enduring that they would still be standing and still astonishing visitors, thousands of years into a future their builders could scarcely have imagined. The tools were all in hand now, the surplus to pay for it, the records to plan and manage it, and the concentrated authority to set tens of thousands of people moving toward a single goal. What that civilization chose to build with those tools would become the most famous monument on the face of the earth, and the story of how it was raised is nothing like the one most people have been told. It is a story not of mystery and miracle, but of mathematics, organization, and an entire society bending itself to a single staggering task. The leap from those first scratch tags to a mountain of engineered stone is one of the most breathtaking accelerations in the human record, and it happened with startling speed. Within only a few centuries of a ruler being buried with little bone labels in a desert tomb, the same civilization, now welded into a powerful and centralized kingdom, was raising structures so colossal that we still struggle to fully believe they were built by hand. It is the historical equivalent of going from inventing the pencil to constructing skyscrapers inside a single long weekend. But crucially, it did not happen overnight, and the popular image of a perfect pyramid simply appearing fully formed, as if delivered by some cosmic catalogue, badly misrepresents what was actually a long, messy, and very human process of figuring it out as they went. The earliest important tombs were not pyramids at all, but low, flat-topped rectangular structures, essentially grand mud brick benches built over a burial, sturdy and respectable, but hardly the stuff of legend. The great breakthrough came when an architect of genuine brilliance had the idea of stacking several of these platforms one on top of another, each smaller than the one below, producing a structure that rose toward the sky in giant steps. This was the first pyramid, the Step Pyramid, and the man credited with conceiving it, a remarkable figure named Imhotep, has the distinction of being one of the earliest individual architects whose name has come down to us at all. He was so revered for this and his other accomplishments that, long after his death, he was elevated practically to the status of a god, which is a fairly impressive performance review for a building project. With that first stepped mountain, the idea of piling stone toward the heavens to honour a dead king was born, and the kingdom became, in effect, obsessed. What followed was a period of intense and occasionally awkward experimentation, because turning a stepped structure into a smooth, true pyramid with flat triangular faces was not at all obvious, and the builders had to learn some hard lessons in the most public way possible. The father of the king who would build the most famous pyramid of all was himself a relentless builder, throwing up more stone monuments than anyone before him, and his attempts read like an engineering laboratory, operating at enormous scale. One of his pyramids has a famously peculiar shape, rising at one steep angle for the lower portion and then abruptly changing to a gentler angle partway up, giving it a distinctly bent profile. The most likely explanation is delightfully relatable. Partway through construction, someone presumably realized the original angle was too ambitious, and the whole thing was at risk of cracking or collapsing under its own weight, so they hastily eased off the slope to save the project. It is, in essence, the world's largest visible correction, a 4,000-year-old monument to the eternal truth that even the grandest plans sometimes need a panicked adjustment halfway through. From these trials, successes and embarrassments alike, the builders finally mastered the geometry of a true smooth-sided pyramid, and the stage was set for the masterpiece. Undeterred by the awkward result, the same prolific king tried again, and this time he got it right. Learning from the near disaster of the bent attempt, His builders began a fresh pyramid at the gentler, safer angle from the very start, and the result was the first large, true, smooth-sided pyramid ever completed, rising in clean, unbroken faces exactly as intended. It was a triumph, the proof that the form could be done properly, and it directly paved the way for what came next. This is the part of the story that the grand legends always skip. The unglamorous chain of attempts, failures, corrections, and refinements stretching across more than one reign, because a flawless masterpiece makes for a better tale when it seems to spring from nowhere. In reality, the most famous pyramid was the beneficiary of an entire inherited education in pyramid building, the final exam passed by a civilization that had already failed and retaken the test more than once. By the time Khufu's architects set to work, they were not guessing. They were standing on the accumulated, hard-won expertise of the builders who had gone before, which is precisely why his monument turned out so staggeringly well. That masterpiece was the Great Pyramid, raised on the plateau of Giza for a king named Khufu, who came to the throne around 2,600 years before the Common Era. He ruled for something in the neighbourhood of a quarter of a century, perhaps around 27 years, and by all appearances the construction of his pyramid consumed essentially the whole of that reign. Think about that for a moment. A king ascends the throne and more or less immediately, the defining national project of his entire time in power becomes the building of his own tomb, a tomb so vast it would take the rest of his life and the coordinated effort of a substantial portion of his kingdom to complete. It is the ultimate expression of a ruler planning for eternity, treating death not as an ending to be feared, but as a destination to be prepared for on a truly monumental budget. This great monument was also not destined to stand alone on its plateau for long, because the family carried on the tradition with gusto. Khufu's successors raised two more substantial pyramids beside his, forming the famous trio that crowns the Giza skyline to this day, one of them built on slightly higher ground so that it appears to rival its predecessor in height despite being a touch smaller, a bit of clever staging that has fooled visitors for thousands of years. Guarding the group sits the enormous reclining stone figure with a human head and a lion's body, the Sphinx, carved from an outcrop of the local rock, and gazing out across the desert with the same patient expression it has worn since the age of these kings. Together they form not a single tomb, but a whole royal cemetery on a superhuman scale, the concentrated burial ground of a dynasty that had decided, more or less, that the proper response to mortality was to build the biggest things on earth. The raw figures involved are the kind that make the mind slide off them, because they are simply too large to picture honestly. The Great Pyramid was assembled from somewhere around 2,300,000 individual blocks of stone, not a few thousand, over 2 million. And these were not light. The average block weighed about 2.5 tons, which is roughly the heft of a large modern car, and some of the stones used deep inside the structure weighed many times more than that. Stacked up, these blocks reached an original height of about 146 meters, and here is the detail that really lands. That height made it the tallest structure built by human hands anywhere on the planet, and it held that record not for a century or two, but for somewhere close to 3,800 years. For nearly 4 millennia, no one anywhere built anything taller. Empires rose and fell, entire languages were born and died, and through all of it, the tallest thing humans had ever made remained a tomb on the edge of the African desert. It is hard to think of any other record in any field that has ever stood so unchallenged for so long. If you want a way to actually feel the scale rather than just nod at the numbers, try this. If the pyramid was built across roughly 20 years, and you do the arithmetic on placing over 2 million blocks in that time, you arrive at a genuinely staggering pace. Working through the daylight hours day after day, year after year, the crews would have had to quarry, transport and set a massive block of stone into place every couple of minutes, without pause, for 2 decades straight. Picture a multi-ton block being precisely positioned faster than you could comfortably finish a cup of tea, and then another and another, hundreds of times every single day, for the better part of a generation. That relentless rhythm, sustained over 20 years, is what it actually took, and it is a far more impressive thing to contemplate than any fantasy, because it speaks to a level of organization, supply, and sheer human coordination that would challenge a major construction firm even now. Beyond the sheer size, what genuinely stuns the engineers who study it is the precision, which has nothing to do with luck and everything to do with serious mathematics. The enormous base of the pyramid is very nearly a perfect square, with sides that differ from one another by only a tiny fraction, and the whole massive footprint is almost perfectly level, despite covering an area you could comfortably lose several city blocks inside. More astonishing still, the four sides are aligned to the cardinal directions, to true north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy that would be respectable using modern instruments, and is frankly absurd for people working with sightlines, shadows, and the stars. This was not slapped together by trial and intuition. Achieving that kind of accuracy at that kind of scale required a sophisticated command of geometry, measurement, and astronomy, the work of a civilization that had been thinking carefully and quantitatively about the world for a very long time. How a people without compasses or modern surveying gear managed to find true north so accurately is a puzzle that has produced several clever theories, and all of them come back to careful watching of the sky. With no magnetic compass available, the builders almost certainly turned to the stars and the sun, tracking the points where particular stars rose and set, or where the sun cast its shortest shadow at midday, and using those reliable celestial markers to fix the true directions before a single block was laid. Establishing a perfectly flat foundation across such an immense footprint demanded equal cunning. One likely method was beautifully simple, using water itself as the ultimate level, since water always settles to a perfectly flat surface. By cutting channels into the bedrock, flooding them, and marking the consistent waterline all around, the builders could establish a dead-level reference across the entire base. It is the sort of solution that is obvious only once someone brilliant has thought of it, turning the most ordinary substance imaginable into a precision instrument. We actually have a window into how these people handled mathematics, and it confirms that their approach was clever, practical, and entirely their own. The clearest surviving record of their mathematical thinking is a remarkable document, a kind of ancient textbook, that lays out how to solve real-world problems of exactly the sort a builder or an administrator would face. Among the concepts it preserves is their elegant way of describing the slope of a pyramid's face, a measure of how far the surface stepped inward for every unit it rose in height. This gave the builders a precise, repeatable way to specify and control the angle of those great inclined sides, ensuring that work crews starting from different corners would meet cleanly at the top rather than producing a lopsided mess. The same body of knowledge shows they had worked out how to calculate the area of a circle to a genuinely good degree of accuracy, arriving at a value for the crucial ratio between a circle and its diameter that comes impressively close to the true figure we use today. They did not have our notation or our symbols, and their methods look unfamiliar to a modern eye, but make no mistake, this was real, functional, powerful mathematics, the indispensable hidden engine behind every perfectly placed block. The inside of the pyramid is every bit as impressive as the outside, and arguably more so, because hidden within that mountain of stone are spaces that solved engineering problems of terrifying difficulty. Deep inside lies the chamber meant to hold the king, lined entirely with granite, and above it the builders faced a serious worry, namely the unimaginable crushing weight of all the stone piled overhead, enough to flatten any ordinary roof. Their solution was ingenious. Above the burial chamber they constructed a series of stacked compartments separated by enormous granite beams, and topping the whole arrangement with a pointed structure designed to channel the colossal downward force outward and away, around the chamber rather than straight down onto it. Leading up to these spaces is a soaring, narrow passage with a high corbelled ceiling, a genuinely beautiful piece of construction that rises through the heart of the pyramid. None of this was decoration. It was structural problem-solving of the highest order, the work of minds that understood how forces travel through stone and engineered the building to carry its own monstrous weight without collapsing inward. Standing in those chambers, surrounded by precisely fitted blocks weighing many tons each, the idea that any of this was thrown together by accident becomes frankly laughable. The stone itself is a story too, and it begins with the simple geological good fortune of the location. The plateau where the pyramid stands is made of limestone, and the bulk of the core blocks were quarried right there on site, hacked out of the very ground the monument sits upon, which neatly solved the problem of how to move millions of tons of rock by not having to move most of it very far at all. But the builders were not content with merely local material for the finer work. The outer surface was once sheathed in a casing of beautiful fine white limestone brought from quarries across the river, polished smooth so that the entire structure would have gleamed brilliantly in the sun, a dazzling white mountain visible for miles, rather than the bare stepped core we see today. And for the most important interior spaces, they hauled enormous blocks of hard granite from a source far up the river, a distance of hundreds of kilometres, transporting stones weighing many tons across that span with nothing but muscle, rope, boats, and ingenuity. The monument was, in a very real sense, assembled from the geological wealth of the land itself, the local rock for the body and the distant treasures for the crown. As for that brilliant white outer skin that once made the pyramid gleam, its later fate is a small lesson in how history treats even its greatest works. For thousands of years the smooth casing stayed in place, but in the medieval era, after a powerful earthquake shook many of the polished blocks loose, people did the entirely practical thing and began carting the fine stone away to use as ready-made building material for the growing city nearby. Bit by bit, the dazzling surface of one of the wonders of the world was recycled into the walls, mosques, and houses of a bustling town, which is either a tragedy or an admirably thrifty bit of ancient recycling, depending on your mood. This is why the pyramid we see today shows its bare, stepped core, rather than the flawless smooth faces its builders intended. Somewhere in the older parts of the nearby city, fragments of the Great Pyramid's original gleaming shell are very likely still standing as somebody's wall, quietly doing a second job their makers never imagined. Which brings us to the question everyone actually wants answered, the one that has launched 1,000 breathless documentaries. How on earth did they move and place all that stone? And the honest answer is that they did it the hard way, with human muscle, simple tools, and brilliant organisation, exactly as you would expect from a people who are very good at solving problems. A reasonable objection at this point is that their tools were made largely of copper, which is a fairly soft metal, hopeless for cutting through hard granite. So how on earth did they shape the stone at all? The answer reveals just how resourceful these workers were. To attack the hardest stone, they did not rely on the metal to do the cutting at all. Instead, they used the copper tools together with sand, an abrasive far harder than copper, working it into saw cuts and drill holes so that the real cutting was done by the gritty sand grinding away the stone while the metal merely drove them along. For shaping and dressing the toughest blocks, they pounded away with hammers made of an even harder stone than the granite itself, patiently battering the surface into shape. It was slow, brutally laborious, and required endless patience, but it absolutely worked, and it required no exotic technology whatsoever, just clever use of the materials nature provided, and a workforce willing to grind at a problem until it gave way. The blocks were cut from the quarry using copper tools, wooden wedges, and relentless labour, then dragged on sledges across the ground. There is a charming and revealing detail here, because the builders had figured out that pouring water onto the sand in front of a heavily loaded sledge dramatically reduces the effort needed to drag it, the dampened sand firming up and sliding far more easily than dry sand. It is a clever trick of practical physics, discovered through experience rather than theory, the kind of hard-won workplace wisdom that does not make it into the grand legends, but absolutely got the job done. To raise the blocks up the rising structure, they almost certainly built great ramps of earth and rubble, hauling the stones up the inclines and then dismantling the ramps as the work finished, though the exact arrangement of those ramps is still cheerfully argued over by experts to this day. And here the great river quietly returns to the story, performing one final service for the people it had always sustained. As we saw earlier, the river flooded every year with reliable regularity, spreading across the surrounding land. That annual flood turned out to be a gift to the pyramid builders in two enormous ways. First, when the fields vanished under floodwater, the vast farming population suddenly had nothing to farm, freeing up an enormous pool of labour at precisely the time of year it was most needed for building. And second, the high water allowed boats laden with heavy stone to float much closer to the construction site than would otherwise have been possible, carrying multi-ton blocks across the flooded plain and dramatically shortening the brutal overland haul. The same yearly inundation that had birthed the civilization now helped it build its greatest monument, freeing the workers and floating the stone in a single seasonal stroke. It is the kind of elegant convenience that almost looks designed, though it was simply a clever people making the most of the rhythms of the land they knew so intimately. Feeding all those people, it turns out, was a logistical challenge nearly as staggering as the building itself, and the evidence for it is written all over the workers' settlement. Keeping a workforce of many thousands fed, day in and day out for 2 decades, required an industrial-scale food operation that the kingdom had to run alongside the construction. Archaeologists have found the remains of large bakeries capable of churning out bread in genuinely enormous quantities, along with facilities for brewing the beer that, together with bread, formed the backbone of the ancient working diet. Herds of cattle, sheep, and goats were driven in from estates across the entire country, specifically to keep the builders supplied with meat, a flow of livestock organised on a national scale, purely to feed the people raising the king's tomb. In other words, behind the visible miracle of the stone there was an equally impressive invisible miracle of supply, a vast machine for growing, baking, brewing, herding, and distributing food to the right people, at the right place, at the right time, every single day for 20 years. The pyramid did not just demand stonemasons and haulers, it demanded bakers, brewers, herders, cooks, and the administrators to coordinate them all, a whole hidden economy humming away to keep the great work fed. This leads directly to one of the most persistent and most thoroughly wrong ideas about the pyramids, the notion that they were built by armies of miserable slaves cracking under the whip, a grim image burned into popular imagination by centuries of dramatic retellings and big-budget films. The actual evidence dug up right beside the pyramids themselves tells a completely different and far more interesting story. Archaeologists discovered the remains of an entire town where the builders lived, along with their cemeteries, and what those discoveries revealed quietly demolished the slave myth. The workers were not foreign captives in chains. They were Egyptians, ordinary people drawn from across the kingdom, organised into teams, housed, fed, and cared for. We know they ate well, because the rubbish heaps of their settlement are full of the bones of cattle and other good food, along with abundant evidence of bread and beer, the staples of an ancient working diet. We know they received medical attention, because some of their skeletons show healed broken bones and even signs of surgery that the individual survived, meaning someone set those bones and tended those injuries. And most tellingly of all, the workers were buried with dignity in proper tombs right in the shadow of the great monuments, an honour that absolutely nobody would have wasted on disposable slaves. You do not give expendable captives a respectable burial next to the king's eternal house. There is a wonderfully human piece of evidence that brings these workers vividly to life and clinches the matter. Tucked away in those hidden compartments above the burial chamber, in spaces never meant for any visitor's eyes, the construction crews left behind casual markings daubed in red paint, the ancient equivalent of workers scrawling on a beam before it gets sealed up forever. These marks include the name of the king himself, and remarkably they are among the only places his name survives written on the entire monument. But more charming still, they include the names the work gangs gave themselves, team names full of pride and personality, groups calling themselves things along the lines of the friends or the followers of the king. Picture that. Crews of labourers, organised into competing teams with their own nicknames, signing their work in a spot they assumed no one would ever see, much the way a modern construction worker might leave a signature in wet concrete. These were not broken, nameless slaves. They were proud working men with team spirit and a sense of belonging to something enormous, and they accidentally left us their calling card across nearly 5,000 years. So if not slaves, then who? And the answer reframes the whole achievement. The labour seems to have functioned largely as a form of national service, a duty owed to the state, with people summoned in rotating shifts to contribute their work as a kind of tax paid in effort rather than goods. Crucially, much of this conscripted labour was drawn in during those flood months when the fields were underwater and the farmers could not work anyway, so a great many of the hands that raised the pyramid belonged to farmers spending their enforced off-season building for their king. This was not a death camp. It was something closer to an enormous state-organised public works programme, demanding and exhausting to be sure, but staffed by free people fulfilling an obligation, fed and housed and treated as a valued workforce. It changes the entire emotional texture of the thing. The Great Pyramid is not a monument to cruelty and bondage. It is a monument to organisation, to the staggering power of a state that could feed, house, coordinate, and motivate tens of thousands of its own people toward a single shared goal over decades. There is a deeper way to look at the whole enterprise that flips the usual question on its head. We tend to ask how the kingdom managed to build the pyramid, but it is at least as true to say that the pyramid helped build the kingdom, pulling together tens of thousands of people from every corner of the land, organising them into teams, feeding and housing them side by side and setting them all to work on one shared and awe-inspiring goal, did something to those people beyond merely moving stone. It welded them together. Farmers who might otherwise have lived and died knowing only their own village instead travelled to a great national project, laboured alongside others from distant regions, ate the same bread, answered to the same central authority, and went home having been part of something vastly larger than themselves. That experience, repeated across the working population over decades, forged a sense of shared identity and common purpose, knitting scattered communities into a single people, answering to a single crown. The monument in this sense was a nation-building exercise dressed up as a tomb. While the king got his stairway to the heavens, the kingdom got something arguably more lasting, a population that had learned through the act of building together to think of itself as one. It is worth confronting, plainly and just once, the other great myth that clings to these structures, the persistent fantasy that they must have been built with the help of visitors from the stars, because no mere ancient humans could possibly have managed it. This idea deserves to be set aside firmly, and not only because there is not a shred of real evidence for it. It deserves to be set aside because, underneath its harmless sci-fi costume, it rests on a quietly insulting assumption, namely that the African people who actually built these monuments could not have been clever, capable and organised enough to do so themselves. Strip away the flying saucers, and what you're left with is simply a refusal to believe that ancient Africans achieved something magnificent through their own intelligence and effort. The truth is so much more impressive than the fantasy. There were no aliens, no lost super-civilization, no magic. There were brilliant engineers, gifted mathematicians, skilled masons, and a vast disciplined workforce, all of them human, all of them local, who solved an extraordinarily hard problem with patience, planning, and muscle. To credit their work to anyone but themselves is to miss the entire point, and to rob real people of a triumph that was theirs alone. The very shape of the pyramid was loaded with meaning, and it was almost certainly no arbitrary choice of form. To the people who built it, the rising tapering structure seems to have carried deep symbolic weight, evoking sacred ideas about creation and the heavens. One interpretation connects it to a primordial mound, the first patch of dry land that, in their understanding of how the world began, rose up out of the waters at the dawn of everything, so that the pyramid became a kind of monument to creation itself. Another links the sloping sides to the rays of the sun streaming down to earth, forming a great stairway or ramp of stone up which the dead king's spirit could climb to join the gods in the sky. Either way, the structure was far more than a fancy grave. It was a religious engine, a machine of belief, its geometry chosen to launch a king from the world of the living into the realm of the eternal. The builders were not merely stacking stone. They were, in their own minds, constructing the very means by which their ruler would conquer death, which rather puts a modern home renovation into perspective. The pyramid was also never meant to stand alone, and seeing it as a single isolated object misses the grander design. It was the centerpiece of a whole sprawling complex built for the king's journey into the afterlife, including temples where rituals would be performed, a long covered walkway connecting the structures, and, fascinatingly, pits containing fully built wooden boats, dismantled and buried beside the pyramid so that the king might have vessels to sail through the heavens in his next existence. One of these ancient boats was discovered remarkably intact, its cedar timbers having survived in the dry conditions for thousands of years, a complete ship buried in the sand for a voyage that was never meant to take place on any earthly water. The whole assembly was a vast machine for eternity, engineered not merely to impress the living but to launch a dead king into the realm of the gods, every element designed around beliefs about death and the journey beyond it that the builders took with the utmost seriousness. So the Great Pyramid stands, in the end, not as a riddle or a miracle, but as a supreme demonstration of what an organised human society is capable of when it pools its knowledge, its wealth, and its labour behind a single overwhelming ambition. It is the product of the very forces we have been tracing all along, the agricultural surplus that freed the labour, the centralised power that could command it, the written records that could plan and manage it, and the accumulated mathematical knowledge that could shape it precisely, all of it rooted in the geological and human richness of the African land. It is, every block of it, a human achievement and an African one. And yet, for all its grandeur, this northern kingdom of the river was not the only power rising along those waters. Far to the south, beyond the reach of the pharaoh's monuments, another great civilization had been growing in strength and ambition, a rival kingdom rich in the one resource the north craved above all others, and the long and tangled relationship between these two powers, by turns trading partners, bitter enemies, and conquerors of one another, would become one of the most dramatic and least told stories in all of ancient history. While the kings of the north were busy turning their stretch of the river into a landscape of stone mountains, they were not the only power on that great waterway, and they knew it. Far upstream, in the lands of what is now Sudan, a rich and formidable kingdom had been growing for ages, and it would spend the next 2,000 years as the North's rival, trading partner, victim, overlord, and, in one of history's most satisfying reversals, its conqueror. This was the kingdom of Kush, and anyone who imagines it as a poor cousin tagging along behind a more brilliant neighbour has the story precisely upside down. At the heart of early Kush stood a city called Kerma, and it was no village. People had been settling the area extraordinarily early, and by around 2,500 years before the Common Era, the city had swelled to a population well over 10,000, which in that age made it a genuine metropolis, one of the great urban centres of the entire continent. Dominating it was an immense structure of mud brick known as the Defufa, a colossal solid mass that ranks among the largest and oldest mud brick buildings ever raised in Africa, a temple and landmark visible from far across the surrounding plain. To put it in perspective, while the northern kingdom expressed its power in cut stone, the south raised its own towering monuments from the humble brick of sun-dried mud, and did so on a scale that still leaves visitors craning their necks. This was a wealthy, organised, monument-building society in its own right, not a faint echo of anyone else. The geography of the river itself helped shape this long rivalry, because the great waterway does not flow smoothly all the way along its course. At several points it crashes over stretches of rock and rapids, churning boulder-strewn barriers that boats cannot easily pass, and these natural obstacles became the rough frontiers between the northern and southern realms, dividing the river into spheres of influence as effectively as any border wall. The southern lands beyond these barriers were a world the northerners both depended on and feared, and they had a telling name for the region, calling it the Land of the Bow, in respect and wariness of its people's legendary skill with that weapon. Nubian archers were famous across the ancient world for their deadly accuracy, prized as warriors and feared as enemies, and the reputation was no idle stereotype. The south bred fighters good enough that their northern neighbours, for all their pyramids and pomp, never forgot to take them seriously. The craftsmanship of Kerma offers another quiet rebuttal to anyone inclined to underrate the place. The potters of this kingdom produced ceramics of extraordinary refinement, delicate thin-walled drinking vessels with a lustrous polished finish, and a striking band of dark colour around the rim shading into a deep red below, so finely made that they rank among the most beautiful pottery produced anywhere in the ancient world, achieving walls that thin and a finish that lustrous, without a potter's wheel of the modern sort, took genuine mastery. And these vessels were clearly luxury items, the fine tableware of a wealthy and discerning elite. A society does not produce art like that by accident or in poverty. It produces it when it has skill, leisure, wealth, and a refined sense of taste, all of which Kerma evidently possessed in abundance. The graves of Kerma's rulers tell us just how much power was concentrated in their hands, and the discovery of this was the work of an American-led expedition that excavated the site in the early 20th century, between roughly 1913 and 1916. What they uncovered in the great royal burial mounds was sobering. Around a single deceased ruler lay hundreds of other bodies, in one case more than 300, individuals who had apparently accompanied their king into the grave, courtiers and attendants who served him in death as they had in life. It is a grim measure of how absolute a king's authority could be, that his passing could draw so many others after him into the tomb. There is also a revealing footnote to that excavation worth mentioning, because the archaeologist in charge, looking at all this sophistication and grandeur, initially could not quite bring himself to believe that the local Nubians had built it themselves, and assumed the place must have been an outpost run by the northern Egyptians. Later scholarship corrected him firmly. Kerma was a thoroughly homegrown Kushite achievement, and the assumption that it could not have been is yet another example of the long, tiresome habit of crediting African accomplishments to anyone but Africans. That habit runs deeper than one stubborn archaeologist, and the South keeps producing finds that challenge it. Among the discoveries from these Nubian lands is an object carved with imagery that some scholars read as the trappings of kingship, a ruler in procession, royal symbols, the visual language of monarchy, and the intriguing possibility raised by such finds is that the idea of sacred kingship may be every bit as old in the south as in the north, perhaps even older. The point is hotly debated and far from settled, and it would be unwise to claim too much from it. But the very fact that it is debatable matters, because for a long time the default assumption was simply that everything important flowed downstream from north to south, that the south merely copied. The evidence increasingly suggests a far more interesting two-way street, with influence and innovation running in both directions along the river, and the south as an originator in its own right rather than a permanent imitator. The relationship between the two great river kingdoms, north and south, was glued together and torn apart by a single glittering substance, and that substance was gold. The lands of Nubia were astonishingly rich in it, laced with mines that produced the precious metal in quantities the northern kingdom craved with something close to desperation. To the people of the north, gold was not merely valuable, it was sacred, the very stuff they believed made up the flesh of their gods, an incorruptible metal that never tarnished and so seemed to belong to the realm of the eternal. A kingdom obsessed with eternity, as we have seen, naturally developed an enormous appetite for the one material that embodied it, and the south held the supply. For long stretches this made for a profitable partnership, with southern gold flowing north in exchange for goods, and the wealth of the great northern dynasties resting, in no small part, on the mines of their southern neighbour. It was, on a good day, a lucrative arrangement for everyone involved. On a bad day, naturally it was war, because where there is that much wealth at stake, peace tends to be a temporary condition. Around 1500 years before the Common Era, a powerful northern ruler decided that trading for the South's riches was less appealing than simply taking them, and launched a devastating campaign upriver. He sacked the great city of Kerma and broke the independent kingdom, and the accounts of his victory include a detail so theatrically brutal that it tells you everything about how these rulers like to advertise their dominance, with the body of the defeated southern king displayed at the front of the conqueror's ship for the triumphant voyage home. The message was not subtle. The South had been crushed, and everyone was meant to know it. What followed was a long occupation. For something like 4 centuries, the lands of the South were absorbed into the Northern Kingdom, governed as essentially a second wing of the realm, its gold and its labour funnelled north, and its affairs overseen by a high official appointed by the pharaoh, a kind of colonial governor who carried the grand title of the king's son of Kush, despite usually being no relation whatsoever. During this period, the two cultures blended deeply, with the southern elite adopting the northern gods, the northern script, the northern styles of art and burial, and the northern way of doing nearly everything, until telling one tradition from the other became genuinely difficult. The northern rulers also planted enormous temples deep in the southern territory, colossal monuments carved into cliffs and raised on the riverbanks, designed in part to awe the local population into submission, and to broadcast in the most unmissable terms possible exactly who was now in charge. Architecture, then as now, made a very effective billboard. The South, for these 400 years, looked very much like a province quietly being digested by its larger neighbour. Anyone watching at the time would have reasonably concluded that the story of Kush was over, swallowed whole. They would have been spectacularly wrong, because power on this river was never a fixed thing. It was a seesaw, and over the centuries the great weight of dominance slid back and forth between north and south more than once. The northern kingdom, which had seemed so eternal, eventually weakened, fractured, and dissolved into squabbling pieces, its central authority collapsing into a patchwork of rival local rulers, none of them strong enough to hold the whole together. And as the north fell into disarray, the south, far from being extinguished, had quietly rebuilt itself into a confident and powerful kingdom once again, ruled now from cities further upriver, its kings devout, ambitious, and watching their fractured neighbour with growing interest. Around 750 years before the Common Era, one of these southern kings decided the moment had come. He was a deeply religious man, an ardent devotee of the chief god whose worship both kingdoms shared, and he framed what he was about to do not as a naked grab for territory, but as a sacred mission, a holy duty to march north and restore proper order and proper piety to a land that had, in his view, fallen into chaos and neglect. So he led his armies down the river and conquered the fragmented north, city by city, presenting himself all the while not as a foreign invader, but as the rightful champion of the old traditions, come to set things right. And when the dust settled, this southern king sat upon the throne of the north as its pharaoh, the founder of a new ruling line. We actually know a surprising amount about this conquering king's personality, because he left behind a detailed written account of his campaign, and it reveals a ruler of strong and rather endearing convictions. He comes across as genuinely, sternly pious, treating the whole war as an act of religious devotion and insisting his soldiers purify themselves before entering sacred spaces. But the detail that humanizes him most is his fury over horses. When he captured one city and discovered that its defenders had let their horses go hungry during the siege, he was reportedly more outraged by the mistreatment of the animals than by the rebellion itself, a king who could forgive his enemies more easily than he could forgive the neglect of a good horse. And here is the final twist that says everything about him. Having conquered the entire northern kingdom and made himself its pharaoh, he did not stay to bask in his new capital. He gathered his loot and his glory and sailed back home to the south, content to rule his vast new empire from the land he had always loved best, leaving the conquered north to be governed in his name. Most conquerors move into the palace. This one preferred to commute from a great distance, which is its own kind of power move. Take a moment to appreciate the magnitude of that reversal. The people of the south, who had been conquered, occupied and ruled as a colony for 4 centuries, had not merely won back their independence. They had turned the tables completely and conquered their former masters, placing their own king on the throne of the very kingdom that had once crushed them. The conquered had become the conquerors. This new dynasty, the rulers history sometimes calls the Black Pharaohs, governed a combined realm that stretched from deep in their southern homeland all the way down to the Mediterranean shore of the Delta, an empire larger than the northern kingdom had ever managed to hold on its own. And rather than tearing down the culture of the land they had taken, these southern kings became its most enthusiastic champions, reviving old religious practices, restoring neglected temples, and even resurrecting the long-abandoned fashion of building pyramids for their royal burials, a tradition the north itself had given up on ages before. They out-Egyptianed the Egyptians, and they did it as proud Kushites from the south. Their reign over the north did not last forever, and the way it ended ties neatly into the other great theme of this part of the story. For all their devotion and their grand restorations, the southern dynasty eventually ran into a rising power from the northeast, a ferociously aggressive empire armed with weapons of iron and a war machine unlike anything the region had seen. After hard fighting, this iron-equipped invader drove the southern kings out of the northern kingdom and back toward their homeland upriver. But this was no humiliating collapse into oblivion. The southern kings simply withdrew to their own deep and ancient territory, where their civilization not only survived but carried on flourishing for centuries more, shifting its center of gravity ever further upriver to cities far beyond the reach of any northern empire. Losing the north was a setback, not an ending. The kingdom of the south would go on to enjoy one of its most brilliant and independent eras, precisely after it stopped trying to rule its troublesome neighbor, which is a lesson in knowing when to go home that plenty of empires never learned. But to tell the story of Africa as nothing more than the long drama of 2 kingdoms squabbling over one river would be to miss most of the continent and most of the point. While these grand events unfolded along that northeastern waterway, vast and equally important transformations were taking place far to the west and deep to the south, among peoples who never built a pyramid and yet changed the future of the entire continent just as profoundly. And one of those transformations involved the mastery of a substance that would reshape human life everywhere it appeared, a technology so important that historians use it to name an entire age. That substance was iron, and the story of how Africans came to command it overturns yet another comfortable old assumption. For a long time, the standard account held that the knowledge of smelting iron was a foreign import, a skill developed somewhere in the lands to the north and east, around what is now Turkey, and only later carried into Africa by outsiders, as though the continent had to wait politely for the rest of the world to deliver the technology to its door. Newer evidence has thrown serious doubt on that tidy tale. In the forested heart of the continent, in the region of what is now the Central African Republic, there are signs that people were producing iron startlingly early, perhaps well over 1,000 years before the Common Era, early enough to suggest they may have worked it out entirely on their own, rather than learning it from anyone else. The most intriguing idea about how it began is wonderfully ordinary. The local soil there is extraordinarily rich in iron, and people had long been firing pottery in it. So it is entirely plausible that, While baking their clay vessels at high heat in that iron-laden earth, they noticed strange metallic lumps forming as a byproduct, and gradually figured out how to coax and refine that accident into a deliberate craft. Civilization-altering technology, born from someone paying close attention to the odd bits left over from making pots. There is a fascinating peculiarity in how this unfolded that sets much of Africa apart from the standard textbook march of progress. In the conventional story told about the ancient world elsewhere, societies pass through a tidy sequence, first learning to work softer metals and bronze, and only much later graduating to the harder challenge of iron. Across large parts of the continent below the desert, that orderly staircase simply did not happen. Many African societies skipped the intermediate steps almost entirely and went more or less straight to iron, the difficult metal, without a long preceding age of bronze. This bothered earlier scholars, who took it as evidence that the technology must have been imported in finished form rather than developed locally, since surely no one invents the hard version first. But it is just as easily read the other way. A people working out metallurgy on their own terms, from their own iron-rich earth, had no reason to follow somebody else's textbook order. They went where their materials and their needs led them, which happened to be straight to the metal that mattered most. Turning that observation into reliable iron-making, however, was anything but ordinary, and it is worth appreciating just how fiendishly difficult the process actually is. The method used was what is called a bloomery, a specially built furnace into which iron-bearing ore and charcoal were packed and then heated to tremendous temperatures, with air pumped or drawn in to feed the fire. The goal was not actually to melt the iron, which requires more heat than these furnaces could reach, but to chemically transform the ore into a spongy glowing mass of raw iron mixed with waste, which then had to be hammered repeatedly while hot to drive out the impurities and consolidate the metal. Every stage of this demanded precise control over temperature, airflow, fuel, and timing, an intricate body of knowledge built up through generations of careful experimentation. So genuinely tricky is the whole business that modern experts attempting to recreate it, even with full knowledge of the chemistry involved, frequently fail to produce decent iron on their first many tries. The people who mastered this with no theory of chemistry whatsoever, working purely from accumulated experience and intuition, were performing something close to alchemy, and unsurprisingly, ironworkers in many African societies came to be regarded with a mixture of awe and unease, treated as figures of near-magical power who could conjure metal out of rock and fire. That aura of mystery around the smith was no mere superstition tacked on as an afterthought. In many African societies, the act of smelting iron became wrapped in elaborate ritual and strict rules, treated as a sacred and slightly dangerous undertaking rather than ordinary labour. The transformation of dull rock into gleaming metal through fire struck people as a kind of miraculous birth, and the symbolism often reflected that, with the furnace itself sometimes built and decorated to resemble a living body, bringing forth new life, and the whole process hedged about with taboos governing who could be present and what could and could not be done while the fire burned. The smelters guarded their knowledge jealously, passing it down within families and keeping the precise secrets of a successful smelt closely held. Far from being crude tinkering, iron-making sat at the spiritual and technological heart of these communities, a craft so vital and so seemingly magical that it was treated with the reverence usually reserved for religion. The blacksmith was not just a useful tradesman, he was a figure of genuine power, standing at the mysterious boundary between the natural world and the made one, and what that metal could do transformed everything it touched. Iron was harder, sharper, and far more useful than anything that had come before it for the practical business of survival. Iron tools meant axes that could clear dense forest, hoes that could break tough ground, and blades that made hunting and harvesting vastly more effective, which together opened up huge new territories to farming and supported larger, more settled populations. Iron weapons reshaped the balance of power between groups, giving those who had them a decisive edge over those who did not. And in many places iron itself became a form of wealth and currency, with worked bars and tools serving as money, valuable enough to store, trade, and use to measure a person's standing. The mastery of iron was, in short, one of the great engines driving the expansion of farming life across the continent, and it was an engine Africans built and ran themselves. The role of iron as money deserves a closer look, because it took forms that a modern wallet would find baffling. In various African societies, Worked iron itself circulated as currency, but not in the shape of tidy coins. Instead, people used iron fashioned into recognizable standardized objects, such as hoe blades, slim rods, or pieces shaped like miniature tools and weapons, and these served as a genuine store of value, used to settle debts, conduct trade, and, very often, to pay the bride price that sealed a marriage. A man's wealth might be measured quite literally in bundles of iron, and a wedding could hinge on handing over the right number of iron blades to the bride's family. It makes a certain elegant sense once you think about it. Iron was useful, durable, hard to fake, took real skill and effort to produce, and everyone wanted it, which is essentially the entire job description of good money. While other parts of the world were stamping faces onto bits of precious metal, here the currency was the very stuff that built the tools and cleared the land. Wealth you could, in a pinch, beat into something genuinely useful. Nowhere is the sophistication of these societies more beautifully on display than in the art of a culture that flourished in central Nigeria during the first millennium before the Common Era, a people we know as the Nok. They left behind a stunning legacy of terracotta sculpture, figures and heads modelled from fired clay with remarkable skill and sensitivity, rendered with intricate detail right down to elaborate hairstyles, beaded jewellery, and finely observed facial features. These were not crude lumps, but genuine works of art, the products of accomplished sculptors working within a rich and confident tradition, and they rank among the earliest known figurative sculpture from anywhere in this part of the world. The continent's deep and ancient attention to personal adornment and the meaning carried in a hairstyle, which we encountered far earlier in this story, here finds expression in clay that has lasted thousands of years. The way the modern world first stumbled onto this culture is a small delight in itself. One of the first of these ancient terracotta heads to come to scholarly attention was noticed in the early 20th century, in the 1940s, perched in service as a humble scarecrow guarding a field, its priceless ancient artistry pressed into duty frightening off birds. An archaeologist recognised it for what it was, and an entire lost civilization of master sculptors was pulled back into the light, having spent who knows how long moonlighting in agricultural pest control. The Nok were more than gifted sculptors too, for they were also among the earliest ironworking peoples in their part of the continent, smelting metal at the same time they were modelling their remarkable clay. Their terracotta works were not all small either. Some of the figures approached life-size, large hollow sculptures of seated and standing people fired from clay, an ambitious technical feat in its own right, since getting a large clay figure to survive the firing without cracking apart is no small trick. What these sculptures were actually for remains largely a mystery, since the people who made them left no writing to explain themselves. They may have honoured ancestors, marked graves, served in shrines, or filled some social role we can only guess at, and then, after flourishing for many centuries, the whole culture faded from view for reasons that are equally unclear, leaving behind only its haunting clay faces, staring out across the ages with their elaborate hairstyles and serene expressions, keeping their secrets to themselves. The greatest of all these Western and Central African developments, though, was not an object or a kingdom, but a movement of people, one of the largest and most consequential migrations in the whole of human history, and one that most people outside the continent have never even heard of. Beginning roughly 5,000 years ago in the borderlands of what are now Nigeria and Cameroon, a group of related peoples whom we call the Bantu began a slow, vast, multi-generational expansion outward across the continent. This was not an invasion or a single dramatic exodus, but a gradual rolling spread over thousands of years as farming, iron-using communities pushed into new lands, settled, grew, and pushed onward again, carrying their languages, their crops, and their metalworking with them. What drove this enormous spread, and how it physically unfolded, is a story of farming and iron working hand in hand. The communities involved were cultivators who had mastered growing their own food, and farming, as we saw long ago, supports far denser populations than foraging does. A growing population eventually needs more land, and so each generation tended to push a little further into new territory, clearing fresh ground for fields. Their iron tools were the key that unlocked this, because iron axes could fell the dense forest, and iron hoes could break ground that would have defeated softer implements, letting them settle country that earlier peoples could not easily farm. The expansion seems to have flowed along two broad fronts, one pushing westward and southward through and around the great central rainforest, the other sweeping east toward the region of the Great Lakes, and then turning south down the eastern side of the continent. As they advanced, these farming newcomers met peoples already living in those lands, communities of hunters and gatherers with far older claims to the territory, and the encounters played out in all the complicated ways such meetings do through mingling, intermarriage, displacement and absorption, gradually reshaping the human map of half a continent. It was less a conquering army than an unstoppable slow tide, advancing not in years but in centuries. The sheer scale of it is hard to overstate. They spread south and east across an enormous portion of the continent, and the linguistic fingerprint they left behind is staggering, with something like 500 related languages descended from that original group spoken today by roughly 2/3 of all the people living in Africa below the Sahara. Few migrations anywhere on Earth have ever reshaped a region so completely. How can anyone possibly trace a migration that left no written records and unfolded across thousands of years, you might reasonably ask? And the answer is one of the more elegant pieces of detective work in the study of the human past. The clue is hidden in the languages themselves. Because all these hundreds of tongues descend from a single ancestral language, they retain telltale family resemblances, shared words and structures that drift and change in predictable ways the longer two languages have been separated. By carefully comparing them, much as one might trace a sprawling family tree from inherited features, linguists can work out which languages are most closely related, roughly how long ago they split apart, and even where the original homeland of the whole family most likely lay, by following the trail of relationships back toward its root. The words people speak today, in other words, carry a faint memory of where their ancestors came from, an invisible map of an ancient journey encoded in everyday speech. It is a reminder that history is not only buried in the ground. Sometimes it is hiding in plain sight, in the very language coming out of people's mouths. By around 3,000 years ago, the leading edge of this great movement had reached the eastern side of the continent, and as these communities settled across the south and east over the centuries that followed, they laid the deep foundations for many of the societies that would later rise there. The peoples and cultures that would eventually flourish along the East African coast and across the southern grasslands, including the trading civilizations of the coast and the great herding societies of the far south, grew in large part from roots planted during this immense expansion. It was a slow tide of farmers and ironworkers that, over millennia, populated and transformed half a continent, and it ranks as one of the defining events in the human story, even if it produced no single monument for tourists to photograph. Taken together, all of this carries a single clear and important lesson, and it is the heart of why this part of the story matters so much. The advanced achievements of these African societies, the mastery of iron, the brilliance of their art, the spread of farming life, the rise and fall of mighty kingdoms, were not gifts handed down from somewhere more sophisticated, nor borrowed wholesale from outsiders who supposedly knew better. They were homegrown, developed by Africans out of their own ingenuity, their own observation, and their own accumulated experience, the same way every people everywhere has ever advanced. The continent that gave the world the human body, the human family, the first art, and one of the first writing systems was also, all along, perfectly capable of inventing its own technologies and building its own civilizations without anyone's permission or assistance. And the story of those river kingdoms to the northeast, far from finished, was about to enter its most dramatic chapter yet, as the southern power, now ruling from a brilliant new capital, would produce a line of formidable warrior rulers, including a fearless queen who would dare to challenge the single mightiest empire the ancient world had ever produced, and live to tell the tale. Having stepped back from the long struggle over the northern kingdom, the southern realm did not fade quietly into the background, as a lesser power might have. Instead, it blossomed. Freed from the exhausting business of ruling its troublesome neighbour, the kingdom shifted its heart deeper into its own territory and entered one of the most brilliant and confident eras of its entire existence, centered on a magnificent new capital whose ruins still rise from the desert today. That capital was Meroe, and by roughly the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, it had become the beating heart of an independent, wealthy, and self-assured civilization that owed nobody anything. The choice of location was inspired. Meroe sat in a generous stretch of land cradled between rivers, a fertile zone often described as an island, where the soil was rich and, crucially, where seasonal rains fell directly on the ground rather than depending entirely on the flooding of a single river. This gave the kingdom an agricultural base that did not hang on the moods of the waters far to the north, a comfortable independence from the very lifeline that the northern kingdom had always been chained to. Here was a society that could grow its own food, on its own land, watered by its own skies, which is a remarkably good foundation for telling a larger and more famous neighbour exactly where it can put its demands. The people of Meroe were also genuinely clever about water, which in a land of seasonal rains and long dry spells was the difference between thriving and starving. Rather than huddling along the riverbank, they engineered large basins and reservoirs to capture and hold the seasonal rainfall, great catchments dug into the landscape that stored water through the parched months and allowed settlement and farming to spread well away from the river itself. It was practical, large-scale water management, the kind of unglamorous engineering that does not get its own legend but quietly underpins an entire civilization. With that stored water, they raised hardy grain crops suited to the climate and kept herds of cattle, building a robust agricultural base that, combined with the riches of iron and trade, gave the kingdom the security and surplus to support its monuments, its armies, and its remarkable line of queens. A society does not field warriors who fight Rome to a standstill on an empty stomach, and Meroe made very sure its stomach was full. But the true engine of Meroe's wealth and power was not its fields. It was iron. As we explored in the mastery of metal across the continent, ironworking was a transformative technology, and Meroe became one of its greatest centres anywhere in the ancient world, a roaring industrial hub turning out the precious metal on an enormous scale. The evidence for this is impossible to miss, because to this day the site is ringed by colossal mounds of slag, the dark, glassy waste left over from the smelting process, heaped up in quantities so vast that they have survived for 2,000 years as small artificial hills. Picture that, an entire skyline of industrial spoil, the accumulated leftovers of generations of furnaces, a monument not to a king or a god but to sheer productive output. Meroe was, in effect, a great manufacturing town, forging the tools, weapons and trade goods that made it rich and that armed it well enough to do something almost no one else in the region dared to contemplate, which was to pick a fight with Rome and not immediately regret it. Meroe was no isolated backwater hammering away at its forges in lonely splendour either. It sat at a great crossroads of trade, and its wealth flowed in along routes that connected it to much of the known world. Caravans and river traffic carried its goods outward and brought exotic riches in, linking the kingdom to the markets of the Mediterranean to the north, and, by way of ports on the nearby sea, to the trading networks reaching all the way to distant lands in the east. Out of Meroe flowed iron, of course, along with gold, ivory, ebony, animal hides, and other treasures of the African interior, while in came fine wares from far-off workshops, and archaeologists digging at the site have turned up objects originating from astonishingly distant places. This was a confident, outward-facing, cosmopolitan civilization, plugged into the commerce of an entire hemisphere, which is worth remembering whenever the deep African interior gets lazily imagined as cut off from the wider world. Meroe was doing brisk international business, while plenty of more famous places were still finding their feet. The kingdom announced its grandeur in stone as well, and anyone arriving at Meroe even now is met by an astonishing sight on the horizon, a whole forest of pyramids, well over 100 of them, clustered across the desert as the tombs of the kingdom's rulers. These were not copies of the famous giants to the north, and the difference is striking once you notice it. The pyramids of Meroe are far smaller, much steeper, and far more slender, rising at sharp angles like a field of stone spearheads pointing at the sky, packed close together in dense royal cemeteries. They are their own distinct architectural tradition, an idea borrowed long ago and then thoroughly made their own, and the sheer number of them tells you how many generations of monarchs this kingdom honoured in this way. And here is the detail that makes them especially remarkable. A great many of those tombs belonged not to kings but to queens, because Meroe had a tradition of female rulers unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient world. The independence of Meroe ran deeper than politics and went right to the soul of the place, into its gods. While the kingdom had long honoured deities inherited from its northern neighbour, by this brilliant later period it was also worshipping powerful gods entirely its own, figures that belonged to no one else. Chief among them was a fearsome lion-headed god of war, a distinctly Meroitic deity who appears again and again in the kingdom's temples and art, a divine protector with the head of a lion who had no real counterpart in the religion of the North. This matters more than a footnote about an unfamiliar god, because it shows a civilization that had taken what it found useful from its neighbours and then grown well beyond it, developing its own beliefs, its own art, its own writing, and its own identity. Meroe was not a faded imitation of a greater culture clinging to borrowed traditions. It was its own thing entirely, proud and distinct, and the lion-headed war god glowering from its temple walls is as good a symbol as any for a kingdom that intended to defend itself on its own terms. This is one of the most extraordinary features of the whole civilization and deserves to be dwelt on, because it cuts so sharply against the usual pattern of ancient societies, where power was, with depressing predictability, a men-only affair. The kingdom of Meroe was repeatedly governed by powerful women, ruling queens who held genuine authority in their own right, who are known by a royal title that has come down to us as Kandake. These were not decorative consorts standing prettily beside a king, nor mothers quietly influencing things from behind a curtain. They were monarchs, commanders, and heads of state, and at one remarkable stretch the kingdom saw several of them in succession within a single century, a run of formidable women at the very top of a powerful nation. In an age when most of the world could not imagine a woman leading an army or signing a treaty, Meroe simply got on with being ruled by exactly such women, apparently without anyone finding it especially scandalous, which is its own quiet rebuke to a great deal of later history. It is worth understanding why women came to hold such power here, because it was not an accident or a one-off fluke. The position seems to have been woven into the very structure of the kingdom, with the royal mother holding an exalted and formal status, and descent and legitimacy flowing in important ways through the female line, so that queens and queen mothers were central pillars of the state rather than occasional exceptions to a male rule. So established was this tradition that the title of these ruling queens echoed far beyond the kingdom's borders and down through the centuries. It even surfaces in one of the most widely read ancient texts in the world, where a queen of this very people is mentioned in passing as the kind of monarch whose treasurer travelled abroad on her behalf, a fleeting reference that preserved the memory of these African queens in a book read by millions who never had the faintest idea it was pointing at the warrior queens of Meroe. The Kandakes were famous enough, powerful enough, and real enough to leave their fingerprint on the wider world's imagination, even where their own kingdom was otherwise forgotten. The most celebrated of all these warrior queens was a woman named Amanirenas, who ruled in the decades on either side of the turn from the 1st century before the Common Era, and she is precisely the sort of historical figure who sounds too dramatic to be real. She was, by surviving accounts, a one-eyed warrior queen, having lost the sight in one eye, which did nothing whatsoever to slow her down. A Greek geographer of the age who recorded what was known of her described her as a formidable, manly sort of woman, by which he meant, in the slightly baffled language of a man from a culture that had no box to put her in, that she was tough, commanding, and not remotely the delicate figure he expected a queen to be. She was about to demonstrate just how tough, against the single most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever assembled. The collision came about because of events far to the north. The famous and glamorous kingdom that had ruled the lower river for so long finally met its end when its last monarch was defeated, and the whole land was swallowed up by the rising empire of Rome around 3 decades before the turn of the era. With that conquest, Rome did not just inherit the river kingdom, it inherited that kingdom's southern frontier, which now butted directly up against the territory of Meroe. And Rome, being Rome, looked south at this wealthy independent kingdom on its new border, and did what it almost always did, which was to start eyeing it hungrily and pushing at the edges, probing for an opportunity to expand. Rome had a well-earned reputation for swallowing neighbours whole, and from the imperial point of view, Meroe must have looked like one more morsel waiting to be picked up. This was a serious miscalculation. When Roman ambitions began pressing on her kingdom's frontier, Amanirenas did not wait politely to be conquered. She went on the offensive. Leading her forces personally, she struck north into the Roman-held territory, and her armies fell upon the frontier settlements with real success, capturing towns, seizing plunder, and generally making it abundantly clear that this particular neighbour was not going to be absorbed without a brutal fight. She did not wage this war entirely alone either. The kingdom's record suggests she campaigned alongside a royal heir, a son or prince who fought at her side as part of the resistance, the two of them sharing the burden of leading a nation against an empire. And remarkably, the kingdom's own account of this great struggle survives, inscribed in the Meroitic script on a monument raised to commemorate the conflict, a victory record written in the Queen's own language. There is a poignant catch to that which we will come back to, but the simple fact that the people of Mero set down their own version of events, in their own writing, rather than leaving the story to be told only by their Roman opponents, is itself a small act of defiance. Most of what the wider world long knew about this war came from the writings of the other side. Mero insisted on keeping its own account, carved in stone, refusing to let Rome have the last word even in the history books. Among the trophies her forces carried home from these raids were statues of the Roman emperor himself, the great ruler whose image stood in the captured towns as a symbol of imperial authority, and what she chose to do with one of those statues is perhaps the single most magnificent act of political theatre in this entire history. Her soldiers had taken the bronze head from one of these imperial statues, the sculpted face of the most powerful man in the known world, and Amanirenas decided it should not be displayed as a mere prize or melted down for its metal. Instead, she had the emperor's bronze head buried in the ground beneath the threshold of a temple, positioned with deliberate care so that every single person who entered that sacred building would walk directly over the face of Rome's supreme ruler, grinding the great emperor's likeness under their feet with every step. It is difficult to imagine a more eloquent expression of contempt. She did not just defeat a Roman force, she turned the very face of the Roman state into a doormat, an everlasting insult delivered to anyone who cared to understand it. And the most delightful part of the whole story is that this is not legend. Archaeologists genuinely uncovered that very bronze head, exactly where she had it placed, beneath the entrance where it had been trodden upon for who knows how long, a real artifact of one queen's spectacular defiance that you can go and look at today. There is something almost eerie about that bronze head, beyond the sheer cheek of how it was used. It was crafted with startling skill, larger than a real human head, and its eyes were inlaid with coloured stone and glass to mimic a living gaze, so that even now, 2,000 years later, the face stares out with an unsettlingly lifelike intensity, as though the emperor is still mildly annoyed about the whole affair. And here is the loveliest irony of all. This particular image of the emperor survived the ages in such beautiful condition precisely because it was buried as an insult. Countless grand statues raised in his honour across the empire were melted down, smashed, or weathered away to nothing over the centuries, but this one, tucked safely under a doorstep in an African temple, specifically so it could be trampled, was protected by the very earth it was hidden in. Amanirenas meant the burial as the ultimate disrespect, and in doing so she accidentally preserved one of the finest surviving portraits of the man for posterity. History, as it so often does, kept the receipt and added a twist of its own. Rome, predictably, did not take this lying down and struck back hard, sending its disciplined legions south in a punishing counterattack that pushed deep into the kingdom's territory and demonstrated, in case anyone had forgotten, exactly why Rome was so feared. But here is where Amanirenas proved she was far more than a bold raider. She was a genuine strategist, and rather than throwing her forces into a doomed pitched battle against the world's finest army on its own terms, she waged a long, clever, grinding campaign, using her knowledge of the land, the harsh climate, and the sheer distance involved to bleed and frustrate the Roman war machine. The fighting dragged on for years, and the longer it went, the clearer it became to the Romans that conquering and holding this remote, well-defended, fiercely led kingdom deep in the African interior was going to cost far more than it could ever be worth. Rome was used to opponents who either crumbled quickly or could be ground down at acceptable cost. Mero, under its one-eyed queen, was proving to be neither. The Roman counterstrike was led by one of the empire's seasoned commanders, who marched his legions deep into the kingdom and even reached and sacked one of its important southern cities, a show of force meant to teach the upstart kingdom a permanent lesson. On paper, Rome had won the exchange. In reality, it had simply discovered how exhausting, expensive, and ultimately pointless it would be to try to hold a vast, hot, distant territory defended by a population that refused to stay beaten. The Roman commander withdrew, leaving a garrison that the kingdom's forces continued to harass, and the whole affair settled into the kind of grinding deadlock that empires quietly come to dread. When the negotiations finally came, the kingdom's envoys did not travel to grovel in the capital. They were received by the Roman emperor himself, who happened at the time to be staying on a Greek island far from home, and there, on equal footing, the terms were hammered out. That an African kingdom's representatives could conclude their business directly with the master of the Roman world and walk away with the better end of the deal tells you exactly how seriously Rome had come to take the one-eyed queen and her stubborn people. In the end, the impossible happened. The mightiest empire on earth, the superpower that had conquered most of the known world and was not in the habit of treating small kingdoms as equals, was brought to the negotiating table by an African queen who had simply refused to lose. The two sides came to terms, and the resulting peace was strikingly favourable to Meroe, with Rome backing off its ambitions, withdrawing from the kingdom's heartland, and even, by some accounts, dropping its demands for tribute. Amanirenas had done what almost no one managed against Rome at the height of its power. She had fought it to a standstill and negotiated a peace as something close to an equal, dealing directly with the empire's supreme ruler himself. That settlement held, and it secured the independence of her kingdom for roughly another 4 centuries, an astonishing achievement won by the nerve and skill of a single remarkable woman. The next time anyone suggests that the ancient world was a place where only men shaped great events, the one-eyed queen who made Rome blink is a rather effective counter-argument. To grasp how remarkable that outcome truly was, you have to understand how Rome normally did business. The empire was not in the habit of compromise. Its usual approach to a defiant neighbour was to crush it utterly, absorb its land, and write a triumphant account of the whole thing for the folks back home, with the defeated party reduced to a line about another barbarian people brought to heel. Equals were not something Rome recognised easily, least of all a kingdom deep in Africa led by a woman it would have been culturally inclined to dismiss twice over. And yet here the empire was, sitting down to negotiate, conceding ground, and walking away from a war it could not win cheaply. That is a category of achievement so rare in the ancient world that it can be counted on very few hands, and it was pulled off by the one-eyed queen and her people. Small wonder that, in the centuries since her story resurfaced, Amanirenas has become a powerful symbol of resistance, and of the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that might makes right. There is a quiet dignity in what the kingdom was actually fighting for, and it sets the two sides apart in a way worth noticing. Rome fought, as it nearly always did, to expand, to swallow, to add another province to a collection that already spanned much of the known world, driven by an appetite for conquest that never really switched off. Meroe fought for something far more modest and far more sympathetic. It fought simply to be left alone, to keep its own land, its own gods, its own queens, and its own way of life, free of a foreign master. The queen was not trying to march on Rome or carve out an empire of her own. She was defending her home against someone who had decided, uninvited, that it ought to belong to them. That is almost certainly why the peace held so well once it was struck, because the kingdom had never wanted anything more than its own independence, and the moment that was secured, it had no reason to keep fighting. There is a lesson tucked in there about the difference between the hunger to dominate and the determination to remain free, and about which of the two tends to wear better over the long run of history. The civilization she defended kept its own distinct identity right down to the way it wrote, and this leaves us with one last tantalizing mystery. The people of Meroe developed their own script, their own system of writing, breaking away from the borrowed northern signs they had used earlier to record their distinct language. And here is the frustrating, fascinating part. Scholars have actually figured out how to pronounce that script. They have cracked the sound values of the symbols, so a modern researcher can look at a Meroitic inscription and sound out the words aloud, reading them phonetically with reasonable confidence. It is worth appreciating just how clever and independent this writing system was, a compact set of only a couple of dozen symbols, each standing for a sound, which is a genuinely efficient and sophisticated approach to writing. Long after the kingdom fell silent, a patient scholar in the early 20th century managed to work out what sounds those symbols represented, essentially rediscovering how to pronounce a language no living person had spoken aloud for more than 1,000 years. It was a brilliant piece of work, and it is exactly what makes the remaining mystery so maddening. The trouble is that nobody knows what those words mean. The language itself remains largely a locked box, because it has no clearly identified living relatives to compare it against, no surviving cousin tongue to unlock its vocabulary. So we are left in the strange position of being able to read Meroe's writing aloud while having almost no idea what we're saying, like singing along to a song in a language you do not speak. Somewhere in those still mute inscriptions lie the records, the prayers, and quite possibly the first-hand account of the queen who humbled Rome, waiting patiently for someone clever enough to finally make them speak. The kingdom kept its secrets, and some of them it keeps to this day. Meroe itself eventually faded, as all things do, its power waning over the centuries until the great iron city was finally abandoned and left to the slow work of the desert, its pyramids standing silent watch over a kingdom that had outlasted empires, and then, in its own time, joined them in memory. The reasons for its decline are still debated, but they likely included the rise of a vigorous new power to the east that eclipsed it in trade and influence, and possibly a quieter, self-inflicted wound as well. There is a real possibility that the very iron industry that made Meroe rich helped undo it, because smelting metal on that colossal scale devoured enormous quantities of wood for charcoal, and centuries of felling trees and grazing herds may have gradually stripped and exhausted the surrounding land, slowly eroding the agricultural base the city depended on. If so, it is a sobering and very modern-sounding cautionary tale, a great civilization quietly consuming the environmental foundation beneath its own feet in pursuit of industry. Whatever the precise mix of causes, the kingdom that had stared down Rome eventually ran its long course and passed into history, leaving its forest of slender pyramids to keep watch over the sand. Amanirenas was not the only formidable queen this kingdom produced either. Another celebrated ruler of the same brilliant era was a queen renowned for her wealth and power, buried in one of those slender pyramids, with a hoard of magnificent gold jewellery fit for a monarch who feared no one. Sadly, the fate of her tomb is also a bleak reminder of how carelessly this heritage was later treated. In the 19th century, a European treasure hunter, hearing rumours of gold, simply tore the tops off a number of the Meroe pyramids with brute force, smashing these irreplaceable ancient monuments apart in his hunt for loot, and in one of them he struck it rich, carrying away that queen's dazzling treasure. It is a grim little episode that captures in miniature the long pattern this whole story has been pushing back against, in which the achievements of Africa were treated by outsiders as a quarry to be plundered, rather than a legacy to be honoured. The pyramids he wrecked still bear their flattened tops to this day, a scar left not by the centuries but by a man with a shovel and an utter lack of imagination. Only much later would the world come to recognise these ruins for the priceless wonders they always were and treat them with the respect their builders deserved. But its long, proud, independent existence is the perfect note on which to draw this whole vast story to a close, because it embodies the single truth this entire journey has been building toward. Think back across the immense span we have travelled together and consider what this one continent gave to the world. It was here, in the shifting valleys of the East, that the human body itself was shaped, the modern form that every person on Earth now wears. It was here that the entire human family traces its single shared ancestry, the deep kinship that binds every living person into one extended bloodline. It was here, on a windswept southern shore, that the human imagination first left its mark, the birth of art and the symbolic mind. It was here that some unknown spark, very possibly language itself, was packed up alongside genes as the true, cultural inheritance carried out to populate the planet. It was here that people learned to herd and to farm, to wring a surplus from the land, and so to build the first complex societies. It was here that one of the world's first true systems of writing was invented to capture and command that surplus. It was here that the labour of an organised state was bent toward raising the most enduring monuments the planet had ever seen. It was here that iron was mastered and spread, reshaping life across half a continent, and it was here that the very idea of kingship and the state took form, governed at times by conquering pharaohs from the south, and by warrior queens who stared down the greatest empire of their age and did not flinch. The human body, the human family, art, language, agriculture, writing, monumental building, metalworking, and the idea of organised rule. Nearly every foundation stone of what we call civilization was first laid on this one continent, by the ancestors of people who would later be told with breathtaking dishonesty that they had contributed nothing and built nothing of their own. Not one of those achievements was a minor thing, and not one of them was borrowed from somewhere else. Each was an original gift to the world, dreamed up and worked out right here. The real story, the one buried for so long beneath neglect and prejudice, and convenient forgetting, is almost the exact opposite. Africa is not a footnote to human history. Africa is its opening chapter, its longest chapter, and in countless ways its most important one. Everything that came afterward, everywhere else on Earth, was built on foundations first laid here, and what we have covered tonight, for all its sweep across 200,000 years, is only the faintest beginning, the barest outline of a story that runs far deeper and wider than any single telling could ever hold. Beyond everything we have touched lie countless more kingdoms, cities, scholars, artists, traders, and empires across the length and breadth of the continent, an entire universe of human achievement still waiting to be widely known and properly honoured. There were great stone cities raised in the south whose mortarless walls still stand. There were fabulously wealthy empires in the west, whose centres of learning drew scholars from across the world, and whose libraries held thousands of manuscripts. There were powerful trading kingdoms along the eastern coast, master metalworkers casting astonishing sculptures in the forests of the west, and mighty realms in the highlands of the east that minted their own coins and built their own towering monuments. Every one of them is a story in its own right, most of them barely whispered in the histories that most of the world grew up learning. The history of Africa is not a small or finished thing. It is enormous, and it is ongoing, and it is, in the truest sense, the history of all of us. So as our long journey through the cradle of humanity finally comes to its rest, let the quiet settle around you, and let these ancient queens and kings, these artists and ironworkers and the very first people drift gently through your thoughts. Thank you for travelling all this way through the deep past with me. Wherever in the world you are, may your sleep be peaceful and untroubled. Good night to you all, and the sweetest of dreams.